Starting us off at number 10 are satanic symbols. Back in 2013, a couple named Janine and AJ moved into a quaint and sweet little house in Springfield, Louisiana. They were so excited to get the house and were amazed at the cheap price. But soon after they moved in, it quickly became apparent as to why the price may have been so low. Things started off small, as it usually does, with their radio turning on all by itself or seeing the lights flicker independently, but soon enough they overheard their son speaking to who he described as an imaginary friend late at night, and they heard a strange voice threaten to begin hurting Janine. Before long, Janine was being assaulted by the unseen presence, waking up to find bruises and scratches, and would often get pushed around by the demon in the middle of the day. She began noticing that the rosaries she hung were spinning in the house, plaster was falling from the ceiling and missing her by mere inches, and she began to seriously fear for her life. One day, her and her husband decided to leave out a tape recorder to see if they could get any proof of the demon occupying their house, and sure enough, when they went to check up on it the next day, they captured a growling sound and the demon saying, "She will die." But the last straw was when they moved a rug in one of the rooms, only to discover that the floor had been covered entirely in satanic symbols. This led them to believe that once upon a time the house had been used by a satanic cult that had likely brought the horrific demon that was taunting them into our world. Needless to say, they packed up everything and got the out of there. Next up at number 9 is Sarah Winchester's mansion. As the story goes, in 1881, Sarah lost her husband to tuberculosis, and in her grief sought out a spiritualist in hopes they could help her contact her husband to help her overcome this tragedy. But instead of getting the solace and closure she was looking for, she received an ominous warning that sent her off the deep end. You see, her late husband's family had created the notorious Winchester rifle that became known as the gun that won the West. What that meant was that thousands had died due to this creation of the gun, so when they reached her late husband in the beyond, he warned Sarah that all their lives' tragedies were a result of the blood money earned from the evil weapon. Next, he explained that spirits were coming after her with a vengeance and she needed to build a home for herself to protect against them. But there was one catch: she could never stop building. If she stopped construction, she would die. Sarah took this omen incredibly seriously and began construction on her property immediately, turning her house into a topsy-turvy maze-like mansion, believing it would confuse any spirits who tried to enter and torture her. There are staircases that lead to nowhere, trapdoors, skylights on the floor, doors that open to walls, and even a door that opens to a second-story drop. With all that, it's said that ghosts really did get trapped inside and now, unable to leave, get madder and madder with each passing day. Many have reported seeing apparitions, voices, and footsteps while visiting. Next up at number 8 is a demon mirror. It's not just homes that demons can allegedly occupy, but they're also a big fan of inanimate objects. In this case, a mirror. According to London roommates Joseph and Sotiris, they scored a free antique mirror from their landlord a few years ago. The friends were young and didn't have much money, so they were just happy to get a free piece of furniture. But after bringing it into their home, strange things started happening, and they soon discovered it had to be connected to the new mirror. The roommates began suffering intense and lucid nightmares and would wake up with brutal stabbing pains all over their body, along with scratch marks. Not only that, they would frequently wake up to find their entire house was practically turned upside down in a complete pigsty, almost as if they had been robbed. Soon enough, they were seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their house and saw glimpses of darkness in the mirror, along with orbs of light appearing out of nowhere in the room. Eventually, they decided to get rid of the mirror and they landed on selling it on eBay with plenty of warning about what to expect. I have to say, I am worried for whoever bought it from them. If it were me, I would have just destroyed it.
Filling our number 7 slot is The Hanging. The Snelson Brinker House was a cabin located near Steelville, Missouri. It was built by Judge Levi Snelson and was actually Crawford County's first ever courthouse. I don't know why they made a cabin a courthouse, but Fine. Years later, John Brinker owned the cabin and he lived with his 2 daughters and a slave called Mary who would take care of the girls. One day, 2-year-old Vienna was found dead and Mary was accused of drowning her. After a very short trial, she was convicted for the murder, hung and buried near the cabin in an unmarked grave. The trial was so short and there was no evidence against her, but since she was seen as lesser than everyone else as a slave, she was convicted. It said her spirit could never rest and it's still in the cabin today. Honestly, I'd also be pissed too if I got killed for something I didn't do. I'd also haunt the out of that cabin as well. Now at number 6 is the dowry. I can barely even call White Otter Castle a cabin even though it was. It was like the mansion equivalent of a cabin at 3 stories and was built by Jimmy McCuwat. The castle even has a turret. Like which cabin has a turret? The cabin can really only be accessed by boat, snowmobile or plane, none of which are that convenient. Jimmy built the whole thing himself and it took him a grueling 12 years to do it. He cut all the logs himself, he hoisted all the beams, it really was a one-man job. He wanted the home to be a dowry for his future bride, which he hadn't even met yet, like he wasn't even engaged. But before his dream could come true, he drowned in a fishing accident in 1918 and his body was found tangled in fishing nets the following year. He was buried near the castle and many claim they've seen his ghost wander in and around the property. Honestly, I would too. He spent 12 years building it only to die 3 years after finishing it. That's such a waste of time. I'd be so pissed. I'd invite all my ghost homies and be like, listen, we're living and haunting here now. Coming in at number 5 is the Perfume. Located in Fort Worth, Texas, Log Cabin Village is actually a living history museum that includes 6 historic cabins, including the one in question, Foster Cabin. During the 1800s, the cabin was home to Harry Foster and his family, and his wife died in the middle of the 1800s at some point, the actual date isn't recorded, and Harry scandalously married his nanny Jane Holt afterwards. It's said Jane wore lilac perfume all the time, and any tourists that visit the cabin now say they can sometimes smell lilacs in certain areas of the house and hear phantom footsteps all around. Honestly, I'm glad it's just a smell in the cabin rather than a full-on haunting. Like this cabin I could deal with, I could stay there. The other ones on the list, not so much, but I could do this one. At number 4 is Upstairs Entertainment. Now Shamrock House was part of a 3-cabin compound and it was built around 1925. Legend has it that a woman called Nancy and 2 of her friends were hired for the cabin to provide upstairs entertainment, and I'll just leave it at that for our PG viewers. At the last minute, Nancy got cold feet and changed her mind and decided to lock herself in the upstairs bathroom. Her father, who was a preacher, heard about the situation quickly after and made his way to Shamrock House as quickly as he possibly could. Nancy was absolutely terrified thinking about what her father would do to her when he got there, even though really, if anything, I feel like he was probably just going to get her out of there and make sure she was safe. But I mean, I could be totally wrong and naive. He could be very pissed and like about to hurt her, I don't really know. But before he could reach, Nancy overdosed on opium and died in the bathroom. Anyone that stays there now has reported hearing hushed cries during the night, which is said to be from Nancy's ghost. Filling our number 3 slot is the Machete Man. Every city has its own local ghost stories, and this one is from Raleigh, North Carolina. There's an abandoned cabin located at the Dead End Creek, and it's apparently haunted by a ghost called the Machete Man. A skeleton was found in the fridge of the cabin and was said to be one of his victims. During the summer, when kids would be out playing near the cabin, they would suddenly start feeling really cold and start hearing the rattling of chains and metal coming from the cabin. The sound was meant to be the machete blade in its scabbard, and when people heard that sound, it meant he had left the cabin and was wandering down Ivy Lane. Say no more, I don't need to be anywhere near a machete-wielding ghost, thank you very much. Now at number 2 is the Cabin of Sounds. Now this cabin is located in Dufferin County, and despite it being a perfectly scenic location, none of the tenants have managed to stay there for long. It was first owned by a bone settler and then the Frame family who lived there till the 1890s, and then it remained abandoned till its current owner bought it. The owner hired some woodcutters to stay in the cabin while they worked, but after they'd moved in, things started going awry. One night they heard banging at the front door and they assumed more workers had arrived, but before one of them could get to the door, the front door opened and closed by itself like some unseen person had just entered the cabin. After that, the men heard noises of people walking above them every single night. They started seeing entities outside the cabin, like weird lights outside the window, a fireball that used to surround the house and then rise above it. As the noises got worse, none of the residents were able to sleep. If they wanted a midnight snack, they'd see the dishes moving by themselves, chairs and beds would just get tossed around. It was havoc. These ghosts trashed the cabin so badly that even the ceiling came flaking off. Honestly, they should start paying rent if they're gonna trash it that badly. The Frame family had heard these sort of complaints from every tenant they had, and after an investigation, officers found human bones and amputations hidden in the attic, probably the work of the bone settler. Either way, it's safe to say the market value of that property has gone down the drain. And finally, at number 1 is Cabin 28. This one could be the next big Netflix docu-series, so just listen up. Located in the Keddy Resort in Sierra Nevada, Sue Sharp and her 5 kids and their friends were staying at some of the cabins during April of 1981 for a nice holiday when the worst of the worst happened. On the morning of April 12, Sue's daughter Sheila walked into Cabin 28 to find the bodies of her mother, her brother John, and their friend Dana. They had all been bound with tape and wire, and all 3 had suffered blunt force trauma to their heads. Bloody knives and a hammer were found near the bodies as well. 3 other kids were also staying in the cabin but remained unharmed, and Sue's other daughter Tina was nowhere to be found. She remained missing for 3 years until her skull and bones were found near Camp 18 near Feather Falls. The horrific quadruple homicide was never solved, and anyone that stayed in the cabin afterwards reported hearing moans and screams during the night, doors opening and closing, and weird light features that would appear and disappear out of nowhere. They say the victims haunt the cabin, which I totally agree with, but it was torn down in 2004, so I mean, I don't know if the ghosts now haunt the land the cabin used to be on, or if they've gone into the light. I don't really know. Starting us off with number 10 is the chimney. This chilled me to my bone and also reminded me of Hannibal for some reason. Back in 2015, construction workers were demolishing an abandoned cabin in Woodland Park when they found skeletal remains inside the chimney. An odontologist identified the remains as belonging to Joshua Maddox. Joshua was 18 when he went on a walk on May 8, 2008 and never came home. His parents knew he was an avid nature lover and went for hikes often, so nothing really seemed out of the blue. When he failed to come home that night, his parents reported him missing a few days later. Days became months, months became years. They didn't understand where he could have gone. I mean, his IQ was very high. They knew it had to be something horrendous for him to go missing. The forest the cabin was in was searched extensively, but not the cabin itself. The worst part was that it was only 2 blocks away from his house. They assumed Josh was trying to shimmy down the chimney to get into the cabin, but then got stuck. His body was found with his knees above his head and his hand covering his face. He definitely didn't die from starvation. It was either dehydration, which meant he died in a few days, or hypothermia, which also would have taken a day or 2. Just imagine, like, I'm sure he was yelling for help but no one could hear him. So claustrophobic, I just can't even imagine it. At least his family got closure though, and they finally found his body. Coming in at number 9 is the runaway family. Back in 2016, a Norwegian man was hiking in the woods when he came across an abandoned family cabin. And I say cabin, but it was like a proper house cabin. Not just a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom thing, it was luxury. Okay, no, but you know what I mean. Thankfully, he had a camera with him, so he actually went inside assuming it'd be empty, but was eerily surprised. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned in a rush. Everything seemed to be where it was supposed to be. It was basically fully furnished. The only fact people were able to find out about the cabin was that it was abandoned in 2005, so the cabin looked exactly as it did when it was left. So many personal belongings were left inside, like wedding photos, clothes, etc. So it looked like the family planned to come back to the house, yet 11 years later they hadn't. Dishes left in the sink, random toys, books, clothes everywhere. It looked like whatever they deemed the most important is what they grabbed. The cabin's rooms just looked like they were frozen in time, and no one knows where this family is, why they left in such a hurry, and if they're even still alive. At number 8 we have the writing retreat. We all know writers sometimes go seclude themselves to get out of their writer's block, you know, maybe go to like a quiet Airbnb in Italy or by the beach in Barbados, not a murder cabin in the middle of nowhere, which is exactly what Tom Taylor decided to do. He booked himself at a remote cabin and recorded all the events that happened to him on his Twitter account. Despite being windy outside all night, the wind chimes outside the cabin only started sounding at 5:30 AM exactly. He went outside to take them off, but when he goes outside, the door slams behind him. Slightly freaked Freaked out, he reaches the chimes and takes them off when he hears the chimes sound again. And it clearly didn't come from the chimes in his hand, now did it? Next, as he's in bed, he hears a footstep which he thought was a kangaroo, and yes, he was in Australia, don't be alarmed, but he saw a human shadow outside the window. If that's not bad enough, a few minutes later his bedroom door flew open out of nowhere, and when he closed it and tried to open it again, the frickin' doorknob just came off. Unable to sleep, he was like, okay, let's just go right in the living room. He went to turn on the TV and it was just static. Honestly, I hope to God he was writing a horror book, cause there's your book right there. Your experience right there you go.
In our 7th spot, we have the lost jacket. When this next individual was just 10 years old, they were at football training camp with a few of their cousins. The training took place at a camp surrounded by a forest. When their training was done, the boys decided to take a walk along the river while waiting for their parents to pick them up. While out exploring though, they found a really nice jacket floating in the water. So the boys decided to fish it out of the water. However, when they turned it over, so did the man wearing it. The man had no face left, it was completely gone. Now, that must have been traumatizing, like seeing such a thing at such a young age, that would completely mess me up for life. Coming in at number 6, we have the elusive beast, aka Mr. Bigfoot. While out camping with his dad, sister, and a couple of his friends, something started harassing them in the middle of the night. Whatever it was started to throw rocks and sticks into their campsite. They ended up shining their flashlight over to the area where the objects were being thrown from. And when they did, the light caught a reflection of eyes and a silhouette. According to the narrator, whatever it was very, very tall and big. When the beast left, the campers were finally able to get some sleep. But eventually they woke up to heavy footsteps in their camp and to the smell of something horrid. To this day, they don't know what it was that they saw, but they believe it might have been the Bigfoot messing with them. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the poop. According to Reddit user EP Ham Radio, when they were younger, they decided to explore an abandoned farm in the Midwest. While exploring it, they found that the upstairs area was just covered in poop. Not only that, but there were tons of claw marks on the walls, as if someone was up there trying to escape. Not only that, but when they were exploring the area, they found a strange bag. When they opened the bag, all they could see was human hair. At that point, they were so scared that they ran the hell out of there as fast as they could. They're scared that if they kept looking through the bag, they would have found that the hair was attached to the head of a dead body in that bag. In our 4th spot today, we have the disappearing bunker. This next story was submitted by Warcrow999. According to him, one day he was with his cousin in a rural area about 30 minutes west of Palm Springs in California. So the pair decided to go on a hike about 20 minutes north of an area called Oak Glen. But there wasn't a trail that led directly to the hills that they wanted to climb. So they trespassed onto a campsite and then followed a stream up towards the hills. They were just making their own pathway and believed that it was going to be a shortcut. But as they started climbing the hills, they realized that they had gone too far and the sun was already setting. So they decided to take another shortcut to get down the hills. As they started their descent, they came across a weird 40-foot building with thick concrete walls in the middle of the forest. It looked as if it was a bunker. The windows had bars on them and the door was made out of heavy steel. They both immediately were drawn to the building, but they got bad vibes from it, so they left. Now, they did make it home safely, but they decided that a couple weeks later they would go back to explore the bunker. However, when they went out to the exact location they had been, the bunker was completely gone, which seems impossible. How could someone move it or destroy it that fast and not leave behind any evidence suggesting that it was once there? Not only that, but apparently when they were hiking, the narrator's wallet fell out of his back pocket. A couple weeks later, his ID showed up in the mail in an envelope. There was no note or a return address. So they think that whoever sent the wallet to him was out there living in this weird concrete house in the woods. In our 3rd spot today, we have the other hikers. Sometimes the strangest things out there can be other humans. This story was submitted by Retroverted Uterus. Very interesting name, but okay, you do you. So they were out camping and hiking with their dog and a friend. On the first day, it was a pretty normal hike and camp out. They even camped out next to another family. The next day, that's when they encountered two really strange men. They were hiking when all of a sudden his dog started to go nuts. He was barking at the men, and normally it's a very friendly dog. The men then approached them and started asking them some really strange questions, like, is it just you two? How long are you guys going to be camping at the spot? Do you do any shooting or anything? Did you bring an axe to cut your own firewood? It seems like they were trying to suss them out, see if they were carrying any weapons. What also was strange is that these men were incredibly clean for having hiked 50 miles and camped out for a few days. And they didn't have anything with them, just a small fanny pack. So that right there was a huge red flag to them. When they finally set up camp, they caught the two men watching them and lurking around their campsite. Thankfully, nothing happened, but they for sure thought that these two men were going to murder them. In our second spot today, we have the abandoned campsite. This next dude is no stranger to the wilderness. He often conducts a number of environmental surveys, and those frequently take place in isolated areas of the wilderness. According to him, the creepiest thing that he had ever come across was an abandoned campsite. It was clearly several years old, but everything was still intact. They had a tent, sleeping bags, pillows, cooking utensils, firewood pile, etc. It's like they decided to walk away and never went back for their things. Or they got dragged off by a bear and eaten alive. And in our number one spot today, we have the shrine. So two friends were out on a midnight stroll on a beach when they came across a weird shrine. There was a blanket laid out on the sand with plants surrounding it. On the blanket was a collection of weird things, from a mirror to a bunch of seashells and some candles. Then there was a plate there with some slices of fruit on it. It literally looked like a ritual took place there, where they made an offering to something. Now, being pretty drunk, the two decided to fool around with the shrine. They touched the mirror and moved some of the candles. The next day, paranormal activity started happening in their home. Sounds of distorted voices could be heard coming from within the walls of their home, and they often felt as if someone was watching their every move. They think that whatever was summoned that night on the beach followed them home and is now haunting.
Starting us off here at number 10 is Black Hag's Cell. Found in a secluded hollow in Limerick County, Ireland, lies a mess of crumbling ruins and the ghost of a satanic nun said to have been buried alive. And if that isn't just the perfect setup for a horror movie. As the legend goes, sometime during the 16th century, the demonic nun would sneak out of her monastery at night to the nearby abbey. It was here she performed her satanic rituals, such as sacrificing animals or placing curses on the locals to please the devil. But one day during a battle between rival houses, the nun was wounded by an arrow and fell unconscious. Believing her to be dead, they buried the nun immediately, but soon farmers started hearing screams coming from her burial plot. At first they brushed it off as nothing, but as the screams continued day in and day out, they rushed to exhume the body, worried they'd buried her too soon. But they were too late. The nun had died and was left with bloody fingers from trying to scratch her way out. It's said at night her screams can still be heard echoing over the hills, and locals don't dare go near in fear that she will possess anyone who steps foot on the land. Coming in at number 9, Hoya Bashu Forest. Known as the Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania, this forest is the breeding ground of unexplained disappearances as well as countless paranormal phenomena. The forest, in fact, has so many terrifying tales surrounding it that many locals refuse to even enter it. But according to those brave enough to try, they were attacked by something indescribable, followed by hours of vomiting, nausea, migraines, and left covered in scratches, bruises, and even burns. Its most haunting legend is that of the forest girl, who allegedly entered at just 5 years old and disappeared. 5 years later, she emerged from the woods wearing the same dress as the day she went missing, and she had no memories or recollection of going missing or what had happened to her in the last 5 years. Some believe that the forest is possessed by a satanic cult. A tour guide once said to have found a group of 60 people gathered in a clearing looking as if they were trying to open a gateway to another dimension, while others think it could be aliens. In 1968, a military technician released a photo he claimed to be a UFO, which was promptly hidden from the public before he was fired. And I mean, it's not every day someone from the military is confirming a UFO sighting. Well, whether it's haunted by a demon or a spot frequented by aliens, either way, I have no interest in checking it out for myself. Next up at number 8 here is the Snechter House. Once home to the Snechter family in the 1980s, they thought they'd found the perfect spot, as it was a fairly affordable house and close to the hospital where their son was being treated. But it wasn't until after they were all settled that they learned the house had operated as a mortuary for several decades since the 1920s. At first, everything seemed alright, but soon they discovered old equipment from the funeral home in their basement. Now, this raised an eyebrow, but they brushed it off and didn't think much of it. That was until they uncovered that their backyard still contained many of the buried corpses, along with eerie photographs of the corpses hidden away in nooks and crannies. Soon they were being haunted by evil spirits, routinely hearing haunting noises and even seeing full-bodied apparitions. The mother claims that when she was mopping the basement, the water would turn red as if it were blood, or that she would catch objects flying around the room while lights would aggressively flicker. At the time, there were rumors circulating that the former funeral directors were guilty of necrophilia, which led to the house becoming haunted by an evil presence, seeking revenge on all that lived in the house for eternity.
In our number 7 spot today, we have Carnival Cruise Line's Triumph. Carnival Cruise Line's Triumph, which is now called Sunrise, was dubbed as the Poop Cruise, and for a very good and disgusting reason. There was a generator fire on board the ship which caused a whole world of trouble. The fire left the entire ship without power, which unfortunately meant no working bathrooms. Passengers were asked to do their business in hazardous waste bags and to throw them into the garbages on deck. But of course, this is only a temporary solution that truly isn't ideal, and one that would not last long. Considering the fact that it took the ship 4 whole days to be towed back from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Alabama, you can only imagine how awful those days must have been. Passengers have described there being more than 2 inches of sewage covering the ground, which I think may have turned me off from cruises forever. 31 passengers later sued for the long-lasting damages, some of them citing PTSD. 27 of these people received $118,000 for them to split, which I don't think was worth all of the fuss of them even suing in the first place. In our number 6 spot today, we have Royal Caribbean's Explorer of the Seas. In 2014, Royal Caribbean's Explorer of the Seas was traveling from New Jersey to the Caribbean when it experienced some troubled waters. I don't mean that literally as in the water, I'm talking more about what happened on board. Cruise ships are known to be a place where viruses spread like wildfire, but this was one of the worst cases we have ever seen. The ship at one point was carrying more sick people than any other boat had ever been carrying since the Center for Disease Control and Prevention began keeping track more than 20 years ago. That most definitely is not a record one would want to hold. At one point, there were apparently 700 passengers who were sick at the same time. Apparently, most of the illnesses contracted on a cruise ship are the result of a norovirus that causes inflammation in the stomach and large intestines. I am just really glad that this terrible outbreak was not coupled with the power outage that the Triumph boat that we talked about before experienced, because that would have been tragic. In our number 5 spot today, we have Carnival Cruise Line's Splendor. Carnival Cruise Line's Splendor had a similar issue to Triumph's. In November of 2010, the ship was stranded in the Pacific Ocean after engine fires caused the ship to lose power. There were 4,500 passengers on board at the time, so this situation was dire. The ship ended up being towed by tugboat back to San Diego, but the passengers were left without power for air conditioning or refrigeration the whole time. The US Navy actually had to airlift in rations for passengers so that they would have something to eat. Luckily, the boat arrived back safely and no passengers were injured. All of the passengers received refunds for their tickets and travel, and they also received vouchers that could be redeemed for a future cruise with the company. In our number 4 spot today, we have the MTS Oceanos. The MTS Oceanos was built by a French company and set out in 1952, but it ended up being purchased by a Greek company in 1976. In 1991, the ship set out for South Africa, led by Captain Yanis Avranas. Because I don't speak sailing, this means nothing to me, but for those of you who understand, the ship was headed into 40-knot winds and 30-foot swells. I assume this is not ideal, as the usual outdoor parties were transferred inside for the time being. The weather conditions ended up worsening that night, and the ship was really rolling from side to side, which is not a good sign. Because of the lack of repairs on the waste disposal system, there ended up being an explosion that led to the ship losing power, and water began filling the generator room, which is never a good sign. Since the generators were down, the ship was simply just adrift, which is truly a nightmare. Of course, a distress call was sent and a bunch of helicopters from South Africa came to the rescue. In a strange and surprising turn of events, the captain and a lot of crew members were the first to be saved from the ship, which left the entertainment staff, who do not get paid enough, to coordinate all of the passengers and the rescue efforts. All 571 people who were on board the ship ended up being rescued, which is the happy ending that we all needed, and the ship ended up sinking nose first into the sea. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Seaborne Spirits. In 2005, the Seaborne Spirits, which is a small cruise ship, was about 100 miles from the coast of Somalia when pirates in speedboats came up and began attacking. The pirates had machine guns they were firing, as well as rocket-propelled grenades, which is insane. The captain was obviously a very quick thinker, as he managed to change the course of the ship and actually was able to get away, which is just so amazing. There were 300 passengers on board, and miraculously, none of them got hurt, which is just the best news. The ship ended up making it all of the way to Seychelles, where everyone could be safe and the damage that the boat had taken could be repaired. I can't imagine how scary this must have been and how stressed that captain would have been, but I am very glad this ended off on a positive note. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Norwegian Dawn. In April of 2005, the Norwegian Dawn was sailing through some extremely rough weather off of the coast of Georgia. The ship was encountering waves that went as high as 70 feet. The third extremely large wave that came crashing down on the boat ended up smashing several windows on the ship, which resulted in the flooding of at least 62 cabins. Unfortunately, there wasn't much that could be done until the storm had passed, but of course, most of the passengers chose to get off the boat as early as they could once it became possible. There were only 4 passengers who ended up being injured, none of which were severe. The damage to the boat wasn't extremely extensive, so they were able to repair it, which is great news. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Costa Concordia. The Costa Concordia was a huge ship with 17 decks, 6 restaurants, and a 3-story theater. The ship was big enough to hold a whopping 4,200 passengers, so there were a lot of people on this boat on January 13th, 2012. On that day, the boat's captain wanted to sail a little closer to the island of Isola del Giglio than he normally would, so that he could impress and salute the residents. He turned off the ship's alarm for the computer navigation system, which turned out to be just as terrible of an idea as you would think it is. He thought he knew the waters well enough to navigate by sight, but when the ship struck an underwater rock, things took a deadly turn. The ship capsized and sank, which unfortunately ended up taking the lives of some of the passengers on board. The captain, who was responsible for the accident in the first place, made one more awful mistake when he abandoned ship while passengers were still stuck on board. Every captain knows that this is a huge faux pas. The recovery for this ship was the largest of its kind, as the huge ship had been entirely dismantled. The captain ended up being sentenced to jail for manslaughter. He of course appealed this decision multiple times, but in 2017, he began serving his 16-year sentence. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have this lost dialysis machine. In 2012, a woman was checking in for her cruise that was off to Jamaica. God, how much would I love to be going on that cruise right now. As she's going through this process, however, she was informed by the cruise line that they were unable to find her portable dialysis machine. This, of course, is a huge problem as this person needed nightly dialysis, and I can't imagine a machine like that would come cheap. To make matters worse, she was then escorted off of the ship without any kind of explanation, and the ship sailed off. She wasn't on the ship, but all of her luggage was, and also most likely the machine that had been misplaced. The cruise line, of course, ended up refunding her ticket, and they also gave her credit for a future cruise, but I'm not exactly sure if she would want to give that company another shot or not. I'm not exactly sure how long it took for her to get her luggage back, or if she was ever able to recover that machine. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Viking Sky Cruise ship. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. In March of 2019, the Viking Sky Cruise ship was off the coast of Norway when the weather got very stormy and the waters began to get really rough, so the ship was actually stranded. The boat was carrying 1,300 people and the passengers began getting airlifted off of the ship, but some had to wait for over 24 hours in order to be able to be rescued. Of course, air was the only way for them to get help because of the conditions of the water. It wasn't safe for any boat to be traveling through. One passenger told the news that the waves were so bad at one point they actually broke a door and passengers were getting thrown around the room. Once the conditions improved, the captain was able to get the ship to a dock where everyone was able to get to safety. There were videos taken by passengers that showed water actually inside the ship, which must have been so scary. People also said that the waves were up to 30 feet high, which I just can't even imagine. I am so glad that everyone was okay after this undoubtedly scary day. In our number 8 spot today, we have the MSC Opera. In June of 2019, the MSC Opera was in Venice, Italy, when it actually crashed into another small boat called the River Countess. Apparently something happened and the engines had got stuck, which is what apparently caused the accident. This of course could have been pretty catastrophic, as an accident like this could not only cause a ton of damages, but also could have been extremely fateful. But in a very fortunate turn of events, everyone walked away from the incident. The opera boat had some scratches that needed to be fixed, of course, as well as the malfunctioning engine. The River Countess was a little bit more banged up in the accident, but nothing too crazy. And only 5 people were injured in this accident, and it is said that none of them were serious, which is just the best news.
Coming in at number 7 is the ancient Ram Inn. Rumored to be the most haunted building in England, there are no shortage of terrifying entities that haunt these grounds. Supposedly, the inn lies atop 2 ley lines, one of which directly intersects with Stonehenge. And if that wasn't enough cause for concern, it was also built over a 5,000-year-old pagan burial ground. According to witnesses, a witch, a poltergeist, a succubus, and an incubus haunt the property, but many think it is much, much more. Legend has it that there are so many demons haunting the grounds that visitors routinely had to get exorcisms after their visit to the inn. Then, in the 1960s, a man named John Humphreys bought the house and decided to make it his own. He had heard the rumors, but believed they were just that, rumors. But on his first night, he felt something strange. There was something watching him, something very, very evil. Despite his inclination that a dark entity possessed his house, he continued to live there, often recounting paranormal sightings like strange voices, orbs of light appearing out of thin air, and said that once a force even grabbed him by the arm and dragged him around the living room. Even so, John remained until his dying days. And I mean, you do you, but if it were me, I would have been gone after the first night. Coming in at number 6 is Castle Huska. Located in North Prague, this castle was built back in the 13th century. Now, there are a few things that are strange about this castle. Firstly, many of its windows are fake. They are simply glass panes in front of complete walls. Secondly, it lacks common things. There's no water source, no kitchen, and for years after its initial construction, there were no occupants. Lastly, the castle was built in a remote area. It was not near any trading routes, nor did it possess any kind of strategic value. That is because it was built for one reason and one reason only: to cover a large hole in the ground. Now, you might be asking yourself, what's so bad about that? Well, according to legend, the hole was actually a gateway to hell, and Satan himself was was said to appear at this very spot. In an attempt to close off the gateway, the castle was constructed atop the hole, hoping to seal it for eternity. But during World War II, German soldiers settled in and used the castle to conduct experiments of the occult variety, and it's believed that these rituals brought out the evil spirits back into our realm. Today, both Satan and some of the evil soldiers haunt the hallowed halls, and some say if you listen closely, you might just be able to hear the scratching of demons trying to join them. Coming in at number 5, the Rose Hall Great House. According to legend, a woman named Annie Palmer moved to Jamaica in the early 1800s. Annie was young, but she was smart and had one big goal in mind: marry rich. While she may have looked sweet and innocent, Annie was actually a renowned voodoo practitioner and became known as the White Witch by the locals. Anyway, after a short while in Jamaica, she met Mr. John Palmer, the owner of the Rose Hall estate, and wasted no time locking him down. After the wedding, Annie moved into the estate with her husband, but not long after, he mysteriously died. As it turns out, it was not so mysterious after all, as Annie had poisoned her husband, and she continued to repeat this pattern twice more while ruling over the estate. And it wasn't just her husbands that Annie was cruel to, she was notoriously brutal to the slaves on the plantation, never hesitating to any one of them that stepped out of line or dared question her. Then there were her lovers. Annie was rumored to have copious amounts of lovers, many of which were enslaved to her, and incidentally, this would also be her downfall. After one of his family members, one of her enslaved lovers, Taku, snuck into Annie's room and killed her in her sleep. Taku was also a voodoo practitioner, and fearing she would haunt him after death, placed a curse on her grave to keep her entrapped. But it said the ritual was never completed, so the ghost of Annie escapes each night, wreaking havoc on trespassers and terrifying all that see her. Next up at number 4 is the Ostrich Inn. During the 17th century, this inn was owned by a man named John Jarman and his wife. The two welcomed travelers from far and wide, but had a special appetite for wealthy customers. When such folks wandered into their inn, they took very kindly to them, offering them free ale and a special room above the kitchen, adorned with much nicer furnishings than the rest. But, as I'm sure you've guessed, there was a huge catch. You see, the bed in this special room was nailed to the floor, and under the bed was a secret trap door. During the night, while their wealthy visitor was sleeping, the husband and wife would pull a lever in their kitchen, dropping the trap door and shooting the poor traveler into a vat of boiling water. Once they were dead, they would rob the wealthy traveler and then hide their body in the cellar. And they might have gotten away with it too if it weren't for Thomas Cole. Cole was a wealthy clothing maker and was swindled by the couple before in the same way as many before him. But luckily, at the time of the incident, his horse happened to break loose and was wandering the town. Folks recognized the horse and thought that Cole must have fallen off, and so a search party began, eventually discovering him dead in the inn. The couple was arrested and sentenced to be hanged, but prior to their death, they confessed to 60 people in their inn. To this day, many have witnessed their evil spirits haunting the halls, as well as all the souls whose lives were lost. Coming in at number 3 is the Demon House. Once the home of Mr. Cranmer, he claims that he and his family lived in this house of horrors for 18 years before an exorcism in 2006 finally drove the demon away. Cranmer says that over the years he would watch helplessly as blood dripped from his walls and invisible hands assaulted him and his family, fearing each day that it might be his last. But where did this possession begin? Well, Cranmer believed it all started with Dr. James Mahon, a former tenant of the home. Dr. Mahon was an alcoholic who routinely performed illegal operations on women in his basement. But not because he was looking to help these women, no, it was because he had a deal with a demon. Cranmer says the demon who haunts the house is Moloch, a demon who feeds off of sacrifices, and that Moloch had possessed Dr. Mahon in order to feed off his basement operations. Once Dr. Mahon died, there was no one left to please this demon, and so he tortured all the families who moved in after, hoping to be able to scare them into giving him what he wanted. Luckily, Mr. Cranmer was able to rid the house of Moloch, and his family escaped the torture unpossessed. Coming in at number 2, the House of Death. Once the home of actress and poet Jan Bryant Bartell in the 1960s, the house holds a reputation for housing some of the most demonic entities in all of New York City. Within weeks of moving in, Jan knew something was deeply wrong with the house. She would often feel the touch of an icy hand across the back of her neck or hear footsteps follow her around the empty house. The house always reeked like something was rotting or dying, and her dogs were always barking into nothingness. Then one day, one of her dogs died, as if out of nowhere, so she decided to take matters into her own hands and called on a psychic medium. But this only angered the demons living inside. During the first session, the medium went into an unusual trance, speaking about the hundreds of bodies buried underneath the house. Jan knew it wasn't the medium speaking, and it was then that she learned how many people had been killed or taken their own lives while living here. Then, all of a sudden, the medium's eyes bulged out of her head and she started shouting that she would never leave in a deep demonic voice. The encounter was enough for Jan to leave and never return. A few years later, she published a book about her life in the haunted house, just weeks before she sadly took her own life. Still think it's just a coincidence? Years later, in 1987, a father brutally killed his own daughter in a drug-fueled rage, and many believe that he could have been possessed by the very same demon that Jan ran away from all those years before. And last up for you today in our number 1 spot, the Armstrong Street House. In 1970, a couple named Anne and Roger Brock moved their family into a beautiful 4-bedroom house in Kokomo, Indiana. The family didn't have a ton of money, but they were able to score the house for just $5 grand, which in hindsight could have been a clue. Mere hours after the family moved in, they began to experience strange things. Lights were flickering and noises were appearing, but they brushed it off as nothing. Then one night, one of the daughters, Lana, was awoken by sudden shaking all around her bed. She thought it was an earthquake at first, but then she looked out her window to see a strange man, seemingly drenched, standing right beside her bedroom window, staring at her. Lana freaked out, but then as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. This became routine for poor Lana, and demons started haunting her every night. One night she heard a knock at her door, and assuming it was her parents, she went to answer it, only to have her mouth covered by an invisible hand. She tried to scream, but the hand wouldn't let her. Suddenly her dog appeared and distracted the entity, allowing Lana to scream for help, but this only angered the spirit. To get back at her, it picked up the dog and threw it out the window, sending it plunging to its demise. Years later, they learned that someone was killed in the house, which could explain the tortures, but still, not a single member of the family has ever dared return.
Starting off this countdown, we have the human tongue. Mr. 420 on Reddit shared his terrifying run-in while out walking in the woods. He was 20 minutes into the trail when he saw a small pink slab of meat on the ground. He picked it up, being like, "What the heck is that?" And that's when he realized that it was a human tongue. Now, you may be wondering, why did he pick it up in the first place? Well, he said that he saw it and he was like, bro, imagine if that is a tongue. And he picks it up and he was like, oh shoot, it actually is a tongue. Like, he didn't expect it to be a real tongue. So when he did figure out what it was, he dropped it immediately. That is absolutely disgusting. In our 9th spot today, we have a pile of animal bones. This next individual was out on a walk with some friends when they stumbled upon a huge pile of animal bones. Now, they live in Ireland. They were hiking up a mountain in rural Ireland, and they said that there's no predatory animals there. So the only thing that could have gathered all these animal bones and put them in a pile would be humans. Not only that, but upon further investigation, they noticed that they were a bunch of different animal bones. It wasn't just from one animal. There were bones of sheeps, rodents, even dog and cat bones. So my question is, why would somebody collect these bones and what were they using it for? Coming in at number 8, we have the interesting decor. So in 2018, Jim Rooker, a former shipbuilder and worker for the US Navy, shared his interesting discovery when out in the desert. So years ago, he used to live in Las Vegas. He would often take drives out to the desert west of town just for fun. While out for his drive, he saw something off in the distance shining bright at him. Since he worked for the US Navy, his initial reaction was that someone had a mirror and they were using it to send an SOS signal for help. After driving about 3 miles south to where the light was shining, he found something very bizarre. It wasn't a person signaling for help. No. Someone had tied about 100 beer cans to some trees. They were just hanging off the branches and reflecting the sun. So Jim was relieved, but also, why would someone do this? Maybe like a DIY wind chimes? I don't know.
Next up at number 7 is a Ouija board. I don't know who decided to let Ouija boards become such an easily accessible item available to purchase at Walmart, because I don't think I have ever heard of it going well for anyone. One of these such stories is that of Tracy and Kieran Fry from South Wales. They became huge names in the British tabloids back in 2015 after they claimed that beginning on Halloween night, 3 incubus demons made their way into their home and began terrorizing them both physically and mentally every night for months. But they really got afraid after their son reported the demon visiting him, threatening to slit both Tracy and Kieran's throats in their sleep. And not long after that, they claimed to have witnessed the apparition in the light of day and even snapped a picture of the demon for the paper. The couple believed that the evil spirits managed to use their Ouija board as a vehicle to infest their home, which they had apparently used previously in an attempt to contact the dead. Eventually, the torture got so bad that they contacted a paranormal investigator as well as a vicar to try and rid the demons of their home, but allegedly only 2 of the entities were able to be squashed, and according to the couple, the demon never actually left and continues to haunt them to this day. Coming in at number 6 is Deanna Simpson. After years of being haunted by several demonic entities in her home, Deanna decided to reach out to reporters to share her story. Although the details have never been confirmed, Deanna claims that the origin of the demons in her home come from a series of gruesome deaths that occurred on the property, and she believes that the spirits are angry and unable to move on from their deaths. Eventually, things got so bad that in 2014, a film crew from Fox 43 arrived to see for themselves if the rumors were true, and what they saw changed their lives forever. As soon as they entered, they knew that Deanna had been telling the truth about the entities in her home. One of the cameramen, Nick Petrillo, said he felt burning all over his hands whenever he tried filming inside the house, and the only thing that made it go away was the holy water that Deanna poured over the area. While the crew was there, she went into more detail about her experience with the demons, explaining she believed it was multiple evil spirits haunting her, and that over the years they frequently tortured both her and her husband, physically and mentally, and she was beginning to lose hope about a better life. Deanna claims that she captured the shadowy figures on film, although this has never been confirmed. Still, the camera crew seemed to be quite on board with her experience. Coming in at number 5 is The Cage. During the witch trial era of Essex, this house was used as a prison for women accused of such sinful acts. During the 16th century, it housed 12 accused witches, one of which was the famous Ursula Kemp, who was tragically hanged for her so-called witchy ways. Whether that is all a coincidence or not is up for debate, but according to the 2004 owner, Vanessa Mitchell, it is a terrifying haunted home filled with deep-seated evil. The demons wasted no time introducing themselves to Vanessa. She claims that the first night in the house, she saw a shadowy figure in the corner and knew right away that something was very, very wrong. Shortly after, she began to feel harassed by the entity, as it would do things like push her when she was home alone, smack her hard enough to leave bruises, and even shoved Vanessa down the stairs. Not only that, she began seeing strange things. Blood stains started showing up on her floors all the time, and objects began launching themselves across the room. Whatever it was, it did not want her there. In an interview, she states that during her 3-year time living in the cage, she witnessed 4 ghosts, 2 men and 1 woman, as well as a horrifying goat demon, which she claims to have captured on camera. Thankfully, she got out alive, but the house remains a notorious spot in Essex, frequented by paranormal enthusiasts hoping to catch a glimpse of the evil entity that nearly killed Vanessa. Next up at number 4 is the Smurl house. Between the years of 1974 to 1989, the Smurl family was subjected to some incredibly terrifying hauntings in their Pennsylvania home. Over the 15 years they lived here, Jack and Janet Smurl, along with the rest of the family members, reported that their TV burst into flames, their toilets would flush themselves, and that various electronics would stop working for no reason at all. But it was at night that the family got truly terrified. They would hear the loud footsteps despite there never being an intruder, and a nauseating smell always filled the house, but only ever at night. Soon enough, things got even scarier. They began finding what appeared to be claw marks all over the bathroom, and then in 1985, a full-bodied apparition began haunting the halls and hovering over them while they were sleeping. The family named her Old Hag, and it seems that after a while the demon got bored of just watching the couple sleep, so it began harassing them, and according to Janet, would routinely commit SA on both her and her husband. That was the final straw for the couple, and so they decided to bring in a priest to exorcise the demon out, but even after 50 exorcisms, the entity refused to tighten its grip. So, fearing for their lives, the family finally moved out in 1989 and never looked back. Next up at number 3 is LaToya Ammons. When LaToya Ammons moved into her quaint home in Gary, Indiana in 2011, she had no clue what was in store for her and her family. According to LaToya, things got bad quickly. The first troubling phenomenon occurred when a huge swarm of large black flies started circling the family's screened-in porch and only seemed to be multiplying. These flies were relentless, even staying through the winter, and as soon as they arrived, so did the sounds of strange footsteps at night. Then one day LaToya saw a shadowy figure walk across her living room and she began to panic. Something evil was in her home. It all came to a head after LaToya witnessed her unconscious 12-year-old levitating above her bed at 2 a.m. So she contacted some clairvoyants to try and rid whatever evil spirit was living in the home. According to the paranormal experts, LaToya's home was haunted by an astonishing 200 demons and was indeed a very dangerous place for her and her family to be living. LaToya decided the best course of action was to undergo exorcisms to rid themselves of anything the demons could have placed on them and flee their home. All I can say is thank God they got out alive. Coming in at number 2 is the Sally House. Built in the 19th century, this haunted Kansas home is named after the ghost that is believed to roam its halls. The haunted house came into light back in 1992 when owners Tony and Deborah Pickman came forward saying that they began experiencing very strange things in their home after the birth of their daughter. What was once a completely normal home was suddenly infested by a demonic entity, covering the couple in scratch marks, cuts, and bruises nearly every day, and anyone else who visited the house received the same treatment. Soon, things only got worse. They were seeing full apparitions of the demons, watching objects float around their house, and hearing strange demonic noises at all hours of the day. It got so bad they contacted investigators who attempted to reach the spirits and reason with them, but the investigators were similarly tortured by whatever it was that was in their home. Eventually they came to realize that Sally, the house's most active ghost, had died here when she was young from a botched appendectomy, and despite what they initially thought of her, she was not the demon herself. Instead, she had somehow become a magnet for dark entities to pass through, almost like a portal for demons to enter their house, and it was them who was making their lives a living hell. By 1994, they had enough and moved out of the horrible house, but have since maintained a website dedicated to their experience there. And last up in our number 1 spot today is Marie and Chris. Marie and Chris had a blended family, each with kids from previous marriages, and lived a very happy life. Until they decided to use a Ouija board to contact Chris's son from the dead. Quickly after beginning, they were contacted by an entity claiming to be Chris's son, but In fact, it was not his son, it was a demon masquerading as him. The demon called itself Frank and began detailing its desire to possess Julie, one of Mary's daughters who had cerebral palsy. This was enough for the couple to know that things were very wrong, and they quickly closed the board and ended the seance. But unbeknownst to them, they had opened a door they couldn't close. The family began being taunted by the entity Frank, and so Chris, thinking it would banish the spirit, decided to burn the Ouija board, but all it did was make Frank angrier and stronger. He began appearing in Mary's dreams, continuing to threaten the life of Julie, to the point where Mary was too afraid to even sleep, fearing it would only be the tortures of the demon all night. The family began seeing faces in the walls at night, waking up with scratches and bruises, and eventually decided to contact a professional. When the investigator arrived, he went to where the spirit was most active and sprinkled talc powder all over the floor there. To everyone's shock the next day, the name Julie had been scrawled into the powder on the floor. At that point, the family decided the only thing to do was to reach out to a Catholic priest for an exorcism. The priest eventually managed to banish Frank, but not before he possessed poor Julie for several hours. Moral of the story? Don't mess with Ouija boards.
Driscoll Hotel, Austin. While there are many reportedly haunted hotels in Texas, this one seems to top many lists for the most ghostly activity. Most of this seems to stem from the very chilling stories of room 525. In the 1880s, there was a young couple that was having their wedding at the hotel, or at least that was the plan. The groom got cold feet and left the bride at the altar. Now, heartbroken, she ran upstairs to their suite, room 525, and took her own life. And it said she still walks the halls in her long white gown. But that isn't the end of the story, because in 1991, another bride was spurned at the altar, and after going on a shopping spree with the groom's stolen credit card, she too returned to room 525 and took her own life. Since then, guests have seen her carrying a pistol and walking into the room, all without ever opening the door. So don't stay in room 525 or you may never check out. There's also an eerie painting that's said to be inhabited by the spirit of a young girl, the daughter of a senator, whose expression seems to change on its own. People who view the painting have said that they feel like they were floating off of the ground, though they remained on the floor. They also say that their equilibrium and balance was off for a few hours after looking at her. Number 9, USS Lexington, Corpus Christi. Now before I tell you about this spooky ship, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you can catch all of our amazing videos. As a naval vessel that saw actual battle, there have been multiple lives that were lost on board, including that of an engine room operator who still roams the ship at night waiting for the battle to end. The crew of the ship have often reported flickering lights and doors slamming on their own, which, given that this is a very well-maintained historical site, you'd think that they would have found the cause by now. Maybe it's just the ghosts of sailors lost to time. Coming in at number 8, we have the Marfa Lights in, you guessed it, the town of Marfa. While there is so much beauty in the area and plenty of non-spooky reasons to visit, the main tourist attraction to this quaint little town are floating, sourceless lights that seem to change color and even move in the night sky. Many visitors make the journey at all times of year to see the lights, and there's even a yearly festival made in their honor. Reported since 1883 by people of all ages and professions, no one knows what these floating orbs are. They appear at random, but usually in the same area of the sky, and since there's so much open space and low light pollution, it's perfect for stargazing, or seeing spooky orbs, I guess. Some say that these lights are UFOs, some say spirits, and others think that they're just headlights. All that I know is that if I see a mysterious floating orb, I'm going the other way. Number 7. Woman Hollering Creek, San Antonio. Said to be the home of La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman, this creepy creek leaves anyone who visits with a sense of dread. As the story goes, La Llorona was a woman who was distraught that her once doting, affectionate husband left her for another woman. And after confronting him and leaving the confrontation with cuts and bruises, she waded into the water, dressed in her best clothes, and drowned herself in the creek, right after doing the same to the rest of her family. Her chilling screams for her children can be heard all the way from the highway. giving her and the creek its very apt name. Many people have felt themselves being drawn towards the water by ghostly voices, and some have even been tugged towards the bank of the creek. Perhaps it's La Llorona looking for her next victim. The screams heard and feelings of being pulled into the water have mostly been reported by younger people, making this all the more terrifying given what La Llorona did. Number 6. El Paso High School. Now, when you're thinking of haunted places, a school isn't exactly the first place that comes to mind, but this one has quite a story. In 1985, the graduating class received their yearbooks, and when basking in the nostalgia of their group photo, they noticed something odd. A woman who no one could identify was in the picture with them. Now, obviously, that would be quite concerning. I know I'd be freaked out if there was someone I'd never seen before standing next to me in a picture. The blurry apparition still has not been identified to this day, but some think it's a student who fell from a window years before, who never got to graduate. I say give her the diploma. She's already in the yearbook. Sticking in El Paso, in our number 5 spot is the Plaza Theater Performing Arts Center. As someone who loves the theater, I try to see as many shows as I can, but I think I'll skip visiting this theater, no matter how good the production is. Built in 1930 as a movie house, demolished for a parking lot in the late 80s, and rebuilt as a live theater space, this building has seen many changes, but some things have stayed constant throughout its history. Many workers of the building have reported seeing a man in one of the box seats, in a tuxedo, smoking a cigarette. One crew member recalls seeing him after turning on the stage lights, sitting alone in the box, as though he'd been there for hours already before the lights came on. And when she saw the smoking man, he turned to her and said, "We all have our time to die," and then threw himself headfirst over the balcony, vanishing before he could hit the ground. A former vice president of the theater also recalls seeing a ghostly girl bouncing a ball in the aisles of the theater and always staring. He also noticed that there was a rag doll that seemed to appear and disappear on its own, moving to locations that it couldn't have without someone's help. Even locked doors didn't seem to stop it from appearing in the projection booth. Number 4. Yorktown Memorial Hospital. Established in 1951, this abandoned hospital has been named one of the most haunted places in America. And since over 2,000 patients are said to have died within its walls before it shuttered its doors in 1992, I can see why. Reports of apparitions of people in hospital gowns running through the corridors or hiding in rooms are numerous, along with moving wheelchairs, disembodied voices, and footsteps. But there are some who have even more chilling stories. While exploring the halls and rooms that have remained largely untouched since its closure, some ghost hunters have been touched, had their clothes tugged on, or even pushed to the ground while being given a ghostly warning. Some of the spirits are believed to be that of patients who had illegal medical experiments performed on them and lost their lives in the process, making for a very vengeful ghost. Number 3. The Screaming Bridge in Arlington. On the night of February 4th, 1961, 6 from the local high school were taking a drive after seeing a movie earlier in the evening. While driving down Bedford Road toward the rail crossing bridge, which had mysteriously been burned down a few years previous, only rebuilt earlier that year, they were startled by another car reversing and honking its horn wildly. This caused the driver to speed up out of fear, and not realizing that the bridge was out, the car careened over the edge and crashed into the other side of the ravine. Unfortunately, 3 of them lost their lives that night, and their screams of terror can still be heard by anyone traveling the renamed Greenbelt Road. The saddest part of this story is that the car that startled them was being driven by a man who had just barely avoided going over the edge of the broken bridge himself, and he was reversing and honking to warn them of the danger ahead. The entire area, now known as Death Crossing, is now blocked off and no traffic travels through. At number 2 on our list, we have La Carafe in Houston. This historic bar, built originally as a bakery in 1860, has been serving patrons for decades, but many come not only for the drinks, but for a paranormal experience. Bartenders and visitors alike have seen apparitions of a hulking man walking upstairs and hearing his giant footsteps pacing the floor. No one knows who this may be, but some say he died there from some nefarious means. The former manager of the bar can also be seen staring out of the top floor window, looking over his patrons and ensuring they're having a good time. And he seems a bit more friendly. However, there are some that report the sounds of a body being dragged across the floor above, but when the sound is followed, nothing's there. Makes you wonder what happened upstairs. And since it's one of the oldest buildings in the city that's been in continuous use, it's become a tourist hotspot and a historical site. Personally, I won't be stopping in for a drink anytime soon, no matter how good the cocktails are. And finally, number 1, the Alamo. While students are taught to remember the Alamo, they don't really teach about all of the spirits who can never forget. In the infamous battle, thousands of soldiers lost their lives, and many were dumped into mass graves and others left to rot out in the sun, so it makes sense that you'd have some pissed off ghosts wandering the ground. There have been countless reports of soldier apparitions walking with weapons in hand, taking their usual patrol, and even full platoons screaming and charging into battle. Even in the afterlife they couldn't get away from war, and so they continue to fight their invisible enemy. There are also accounts of a small blonde-haired boy hiding in multiple places where the gift shop now stands, so make sure to pick up your haunted keychains. While the buildings are beautiful to look at and the area is interesting to explore, the history can leave one with a haunting feeling, and with all those spirits around, I'd be careful touring here, especially at night. Number 10, Café du Monde. Café du Monde is probably one of the most well-known places on this list, mostly for having what many people say are the best beignets in town. But there can be a problem with the service. No, not from the employees, I'm sure that they're amazing, but apparently some people give their order to a waiter only to never have it arrive, or see the waiter again. Since the restaurant is open 24 hours a day, some customers have seen some freaky things at night, including a ghost waiter who has been haunting the place for decades. No one knows who they might have been, but they must have loved their job a whole lot if they keep coming back to work after they've passed on. Or maybe they worked themselves to death and can't escape the horrors of the night shift. As someone with a lot of restaurant experience, I feel bad for not only the ghostly server, but for the folks who never got their orders. Number 9, the Old French Opera House. Before we move on to number 9, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons so that I can keep bringing you the most amazing videos. While it no longer stands today, and many bars and businesses take up the space where it once was, the witch of the Opera House still lurks in the area of her final resting place. Her story begins in the 1860s. Her name was Marguerite, and she made quite a splash during her debut, but not because she was a good singer. Apparently she wasn't, but it was because of her beauty. After a while, people began to see through her, and they realized that beauty wasn't enough to carry a show, and her career dried up. Financially ruined after losing her career and husband due to a sudden accident, Marguerite decided to fall back and open a bakery. But there was a problem. She couldn't bake. So she sent for the best Parisian pastry chef that she could find, and he came to work for her. And he was pretty easy on the eyes. They fell for each other and they were happy for years. Then one day she heard that her new husband was cheating on her and had a second apartment that they used as a love nest. Enraged, she went to the apartment in the middle of the night, turned on the gas in the fireplace, and left with the gas leaking out. The chef and the mistress suffocated, and Marguerite broke into the opera house and hung herself from the chandelier in her old costume, which she'd stolen from the production. They say that you can still hear her and see her screaming for her lost love in the street where the opera house once stood. Number 8, the Old Absinthe House. It was originally built in 1752, but burned down in the Great Friday Fire of 1788. When it was rebuilt, it became a place for people to meet and discuss less than savory topics, and have some absinthe, a very strong alcohol that was said to have hallucinogenic properties. While many people gathered for drinks here, there was one meeting that took place that was instrumental in American history. According to the legend, in 1815, General Andrew Jackson called for a meeting with someone you wouldn't expect, a notorious pirate by the name of Jean Lafitte. Now, why was a general meeting with a pirate? Well, he needed help with the impending battle with the British for the city, and he knew that Jean knew the city and its surrounding swamps and waters like the back of his hand. In exchange for full pardons, Jackson had Jean's army of pirates released from jail so that they could assist with the war, and they actually helped him turn the tide of what became known as the Battle for New Orleans. Lafitte can still be seen at his favorite spot in the bar on the second floor, wearing his hat and indulging himself with food and drink. Others have spotted the ghosts of Andrew Jackson, as well as Marie Laveau and Madame Lalaurie, both of whom we'll talk about in a little while. With all of these spirits around and reports of slamming doors, footsteps, and flying bottles, I'd stay away from here. In our number 7 spot, we have the Faulkner House. William Faulkner was a Nobel Prize winning author who wrote many amazing works, including The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying. Faulkner moved to this house on Pirates Alley in the 1920s, and it's actually where he wrote his first first novel, A Soldier's Pay. The house was bought by a couple in 1990 and turned into a bookstore, but apparently Faulkner never left. Visitors report the smell of pipe smoke, which the author was smoking constantly, while the new owners were not, as well as books falling off the shelves, usually books written by him. I feel like buying a haunted book is just a recipe for trouble, even if it's a classic. Number 6. Le Petit Theatre. Established in 1916, this theater has been the host to many plays and performers over the years, but one has become more infamous than the rest. In 1930s, many plays were coming through, touring the South, and one of them was led by a performer called Caroline. Her last name has been lost to time. Right before a performance, she decided to go for a walk outside on the theater's balcony and tragically fell over the rail and lost her life. Now, visitors of the theater who go stand in the spot she fell from report a sudden drop in temperature and feel a pull towards the edge. Some people also say that they've seen Caroline's reflection in the water of the theater's fountain, still in costume, ready to go on stage. What is it with NOLA and haunted theaters? Number 5. Sultan's Palace. In 1839, Jean-Baptiste Lepret purchased a lavish half-story mansion from a struggling dentist as a new home for his brother, who just so happened to be a sultan from a far-off land. When the sultan arrived by ship, he brought with him a harem of wives, eunuchs, and all sorts of lavish furniture, all of which paraded through the street on their way to the house. Townspeople who lived nearby heard all-night parties and the smell of smoke emanating from within the palace, and were put off that they were never invited. But one day a man was walking by and he saw something shocking. Blood dripping down the front steps and forming a pool in the street. The man fled to a police station to tell them about what he'd found, and when the police arrived, they saw quite a grisly scene. Bodies were lying all over the floor, some with missing limbs, some cut open and broken as though some sort of beast had torn them apart. But the most disturbing find was in the courtyard, where through the wet soil a hand was reaching up, but not moving, as if whoever belonged to it was asking for help after being buried alive. When they dug him up, they recognized him as the Sultan himself. The case was never solved, but it was believed to be the brother's doing that caused the horrors, as his body was never found, and he had the most to gain from the Sultan's death. Number 4. Pharmacy Museum. Now, I know a pharmacy museum doesn't sound that exciting, but stay with me here. In 1823, Louis de Filo, the nation's first licensed pharmacist, opened a pharmacy where the museum now stands, and ran it successfully for years. But in 1855, he sold it to Dr. Joseph Dupas, who lived there until he died of syphilis in 1867. But it seems that he got what he deserved. Dr. Dupas allegedly was performing shocking experiments on pregnant slaves, as well as other horrible things like poisoning with what he told people was medicine. It is said that his spirit is doomed to haunt the museum, where some of the remnants of his grotesque experiments still remain, and visitors have reported seeing him in a brown suit, throwing books, and even pushing people to the ground. He seems like a vengeful spirit, so stay away from here. Number 3. Marie Laveau's house. Marie Laveau is perhaps one of the most well-known and allegedly most powerful voodoo practitioners of all time. Born in 1794, she was the student and successor of Dr. John, a voodoo priest who was supposedly an African prince from Senegal. She would often conduct business in Congo Square, earning the favor of slaves by giving them charms, cures, and even spells in return for information on their masters. She used this information when the masters requested her services to impress them in a simpler way before showing her true power and conducting rituals. The house where she lived was also said to be a meeting place for people, where they performed chants and rituals late into the night. The house was torn down in 1903, but a new structure, which is now a vacation rental, was built on the same foundations, and some say that that's how her spirit still remains in the house. One couple recounted the story of their stay, where late one night they heard chanting and drumming. They checked outside, but there was no one there. When they realized the sounds were coming from the empty living room, they decided to not sleep there that night. Good call. When they returned the next morning, there was a single pristine feather lying in the middle of the living room, but all of the doors and the windows were locked tight. They checked out immediately and never returned, because to a voodoo practitioner, a feather is good luck, but to an unsuspecting person, it is an omen of death or a hex having been placed upon you. So stay away from here if you don't wish to be cursed. Number 2. St. Louis Cemetery, number 1. Established in 1789, this cemetery is New Orleans' oldest extant gravesite and is also considered one of the most haunted cemeteries in the US. With over 700 tombs and over 100,000 dead buried here, it makes sense that there would be some spirits that hung around. While most ghosts are said to haunt the places that they died, and not their graves, something about this place draws them in, and there are some very famous ones who reside here. Allegedly, our good friend Marie Laveau is seen here more often than anywhere else, though some claim that she still lives after creating an immortality potion, and she comes here, where her tomb also resides, to communicate with the dead, only to be mistaken for a spirit. It's said that if you place 3 X's on her tomb, your wish will be granted, and if it is, you must return and place a gift, or you will face the consequences. Some people report falling ill here, sudden bruises or cuts appearing, and hearing voices. Other spirits of the cemetery include that of a sailor, whose family tomb was sold out from under him while on the high seas, and he's looking for somewhere to rest his soul. And finally, we reach number 1, the house of Madame Delphine Lalaurie. Delphine was a wealthy woman of high stature who married into even more riches and a grand house. She was also played by Kathy Bates in season 3 of American Horror Story. Her and her husband were often heard screaming and arguing all the way from the street, and he eventually left her after finding out some of her dark secrets. Lalaurie was a monstrous woman who performed terrible experiments on slaves that worked in her house, and her world came crashing down when a fire started in her home. When men arrived to put the fire out, they found many horrors in the attic. They found 7 slaves who were suspended by the neck and stretched and bent into horrible positions which they were bound into. Some had pieces of skin flayed off or missing limbs, and one woman had apparently had her bones broken such that she could be fit into a box. Delphine fled the city that night and never returned, but it's said that the ghosts of those who were mutilated there haunt the house looking for their revenge. A man who lived there in the 1900s heard the voices telling him to do horrible things, and eventually he took his own life, proving that the spirits want no one to enter the house where such atrocities happened.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Eric Freen. This real piece of work is responsible for a horrible attack that took place in 2014. On September 12th, 2014, during a shift change late at night at the trooper barracks of the Pennsylvania State Police in the Pocono Mountains in the township of Blooming Grove, Pennsylvania, Eric, hiding from sight, opened fire at the officers, which sadly ended up taking the life of Corporal Brian K. Dixon II, who was a 38-year-old Pennsylvania State Police trooper, and it also critically injured Trooper Alex Douglas. Through the discovery of a vehicle that was partially submerged in a pond 3 days after this incident, Eric was able to be identified as the only suspect in the crime, which is when the manhunt really began. By September 24th, there was 1,000 officers looking for him, even utilizing tracking dogs, as Eric continued to successfully evade them because of his extensive knowledge of survival skills. In the end, Eric was captured by US Marshals in an open field near an unused airport hangar 48 days after his crimes took place. One thing that I really like that the officers who arrested him did is that they used the handcuffs of Officer Brian Dixon to restrain him. They also used his squad car to transport the criminal. On April 19th, 2017, Eric was found guilty on all of the charges brought against him, and on April 26th, the jury recommended the death penalty, with the formal sentence of lethal injection being given the next day. He still remains on death row at SCI Phoenix, which is a maximum security prison in Pennsylvania. In our number 9 spot today, we have Eric Rudolph. I guess the Erics just love to go on the run in the woods. This horrible person is responsible for a series of attacks that took place between 1996 and 1998. The first attack took place on July 27th, 1996, when he planted a bomb in Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta as people were gathered there to watch the 1996 Summer Olympics. This blast alone took the life of one woman and injured 100 others, and in a really strange move, before the blast went off, Eric actually called 911 twice to warn of what was about to happen. After this terrible incident, Eric continued on to do horrible things when he placed 2 more bombs in Georgia and 1 in Birmingham, Alabama, which resulted in several injuries and the death of a police officer. Eric was a very skilled outdoorsman, which gave him the opportunity to continually elude authorities for the years he was doing these things. Former FBI executive Chris Swecker, who is the head of the Charlotte FBI office when Eric was arrested, said of Eric's time hiding in the woods that it was actually made possible because, quote, there are so many cabins up there that nobody goes anywhere near because they are owned by people out of town. I think it is very likely that he not only had campsites and caves, but he was also spending spending time in those cabins. He knew exactly which cabins he could go into. He had them scouted out way ahead of time. He also said when asked if Eric was a survivalist, quote, "He was anticipating a great conflict and he had clearly lined up caves and campsites where he could go. He had a number of hiding places and he knew the mountains so well that he could navigate them at night." In the end, on May 31st, 2003, Rudolph was arrested by police officer J.S. Postal while rummaging through a trash bin behind a rural grocery store in Murphy, North Carolina. He received a plea deal which saw him avoiding the death penalty and instead receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. In our number 8 spot today, we have David Sweat and Richard Matt. Back in 2015, two men named David Sweat and Richard Matt were serving time in the same prison when they both made a plan to escape, and it worked. The two inmates had a plan that involved manipulating two prison employees into smuggling in the tools they needed in frozen hamburger meat, after which they were able to cut holes in the steel at the back of their cells. Once they were out of prison, the men were meant to stay together for a while, but things quickly started to fall apart for both of them. Firstly, one of their main accomplices, a prison employee by the name of Joyce Mitchell, failed to show up with a getaway car and supplies, which meant that David and Richard were fleeing to the Canadian border on foot now, not like they had planned. It's important to note that both of these men were quite dangerous, especially David, who had already taken the life of two separate people, which is why he was in prison in the first place. For the next 3 weeks, there was a huge manhunt that cost the state of New York $23 million. As the authorities were searching for them day in and day out, the relationship between the two escapees started to dwindle because Richard didn't mind the life out in the woods. I mean, it had to have been better than living in prison. David, on the other hand, wanted to follow through and getting to Canada. The two spent 18 days in the wilderness together trying to survive, trying to get along, and trying to evade authorities, and this is when the two ended up splitting up because of their differences. Richard told authorities, quote, "I told Matt, I said, look, there's a cop right there. So I start hauling ass. I said, we gotta move, you're not keeping up. I said, you know what, I hate to do it to him, but I kept my part of the deal, I got him out, and I bolted on him. I just left him there." 3 days after the two split up, Richard was found by authorities, but when he failed to drop his weapon, he was killed on the spot. David, on the other hand, was caught 48 hours after Richard, and while he too was injured during the apprehension, he survived, was captured, and was placed right back in prison. In our number 7 spot today, we have Troy Knapp. Often referred to as the Mountain Man, Troy had an early start on his criminal history, and this history is what landed him in prison for burglary. After being released while on parole in 2004, Troy really fell off the map because he began to live a life on the run, living in the wilderness. By the time 2007 rolled around, authorities in southern Utah were investigating a string of cabin burglaries that they believed were all committed by one person, and it wasn't until 2012 that this person would be identified as Troy Knapp. They were able to confirm this through cabin surveillance photos as well as a fingerprint that was left behind on a bottle of alcohol. From his disappearance in 2004 until his eventual capture in 2013, Troy survived by breaking into people's cabins, sleeping in the owner's beds, eating their food, and listening to their radios for any updates on the hunt to find him. He would also sometimes steal items from the cabin, including weapons and camping supplies, which he used to help him live in the woods until the next cabin break-in. As authorities closed in on him in 2013, Troy decided to try and shoot at federal agents in a helicopter as they flushed him out of the home he was staying in. Luckily, none of the officers were harmed and Troy was captured that day. In the end, Troy received a plea deal for all of the crimes committed and received a sentence that could see him being released in 2024. In our number 6 spot today, we have Mincho Donchev. This is the name of a convicted killer who went on the run in the woods after escaping from a Bulgarian prison. Well, actually, Mincho escaped from the prison, moved to the United States, was convicted in Seattle for trying to burn down a home in 1985, and after this is when he fled to the woods. For over 10 years, Mincho lived this life on the lam. He moved through Washington State. He carried on by stealing food, clothes, and other supplies from nearby vacation cabins. Of course, the multitude of break-ins caused an investigation to begin, and eventually he was caught and arrested for these crimes. Once he was arrested again, I assumed he would likely be returned to Bulgaria to finish out his sentence for the killing, but in the end he was no longer wanted in Bulgaria because the statute of limitations had expired. In the United States, however, he was once again tried and convicted, this time for all of the break-ins and robberies he committed accumulated over the decade. In our number 5 spot today, we have Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski is most often referred to as the Unabomber due to the atrocious crimes that he committed. He was known as being quite bright from a young age, and it is believed that he had an IQ of about 167. He was accepted into Harvard at the age of just 16 years old, and he went on to receive a PhD. At 25, things were still looking bright for the guy. He had landed himself a job as an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley, but 2 years later he resigned from that position and his life took quite a drastic and dark turn. In 1971, it is said that Ted moved to a remote cabin in Montana that had no electricity or running water, and from 1971 until 1977, Ted learned to live a hermit, off-the-grid lifestyle while learning different survival skills. But once 1978 rolled around, he was ready to start his terror campaign. From here until 1995, he began a nationwide bombing against people who were involved with modern technology. He planted these weapons or would mail them, and in the end it took the lives of 3 people and severely injured 23. Just like many of these kinds of people, his own ego and delusions got in the way, because on April 24th, 1995, he sent an anonymous handwritten letter that was addressed to the police via the New York Times. His own brother ended up recognizing his handwriting, however, and that's the tip that he gave to the FBI. Ted was captured, tried, and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. In our number 4 spot today, we have the deserter. Back in 2015, police in the far east of Russia discovered a man who is said to have been a deserter of the army 11 years prior and who had been hiding in the woods ever since. The man was in his 30s and had been wanted since he disappeared from his post back in 2014, which was 1 year after he was conscribed. It actually turns out that when found, authorities weren't looking for him anymore. This was because a few months after he initially left his post, some of his family members had identified his body, which led to him being declared dead. So imagine the officer's surprise when they found him very much alive. In the end, he was found after residents of a local village reported seeing a suspicious inhabitant who had settled nearby. The man was able to survive by foraging for berries and mushrooms, and he built a small house using old construction materials. And during his time living off-grid, he worked at a pig farm and went fishing to earn some kind of a living and surely to feed himself. During his 11 years living in the woods, authorities don't believe he ever tried to contact anyone, friends or family. The man was detained after his discovery, but it's not clear if any charges were ever pressed due to the amount of time that had passed. In our number 3 spot today, we have Christopher Knight. Christopher is a person who was quite reclusive, and he lived alone in the woods in Maine. He loved being alone and loved living a simple life, which definitely sounds fine enough, and it's said that save for 2 brief interactions, he lived without human contact for 27 years from 1986 to 2013. I'm certainly not judging, I'm genuinely just wondering what that sort of thing would do to a person. Here's where things get sort of unbelievable though. While living this totally secluded life in the woods of Maine, he was living in a small camp that he had set up that was kind of hidden from everyone because it was within a cluster of glacial erratic boulders. When he entered the woods, he had almost no possessions, which of course would make things difficult to survive, but he made a little home and set up for himself entirely out of stolen items. That's right, this guy would go around to other camps and cabins nearby and steal their stuff, roughly 40 burglaries a day in order to continue on surviving while having no contact with anyone else. I guess the guy didn't really have any scary motives, but of course you absolutely cannot steal people's belongings. Eventually he was caught mid-burglary and he confessed to all of the other crimes, and he did describe his understanding of how unethical his behavior was, and it was determined he was very unlikely to reoffend. Christopher spent 7 months in jail, he paid $2,000 in restitution, and he completed a court program and 3 years of probation. After his release, he went on to meet with the judge every week, he avoided alcohol, and he even secured a job with his brother. There have been many articles written about Christopher's pretty fascinating story, and people are always trying to get to the bottom of why he lived his life like this. He is quite reluctant to share, but what he has said is, quote, "Solitude bestows an increase in something valuable, my perception, but when I applied my increased perception to myself, I lost my identity. There was no audience, no one to perform for. To put it romantically, I was completely free." In our number 2 spot today, we have David Lidstone. For nearly 3 decades, 81-year-old David Lidstone has lived in the woods of New Hampshire in a small cabin that is fit with solar panels to provide him power. I'll be honest, David is not a terrifying person, and in fact it seems as though he really minded his own business. He grew his own food, cut his own firewood, and spent spent his time tending to the chickens he had, as well as the pet cat. He was just a man living an off-the-grid life, but a few years ago, an unfortunate revelation came to life that threatened everything that David had built. David actually found himself being arrested after he was accused of squatting on private property for the 27 years he was living in this self-sustained cabin because the man who owns the land wanted Dave and his cabin gone. The land that the cabin sits on has been owned by the same family since 1963, and while David claims that many years ago the owner gave him his word allowing him to live there, unfortunately he failed to get this promise in writing. This has led to the situation where the current owner now sees him as a squatter. The landowner claims to have not even known of David's presence until 2015 when a town administrator brought it to his attention due to some concerns over the property. While many people, especially kayakers and boaters who have come to know Dave quite well over the years since his cabin sits right on the river, have offered to help cover the costs to allow him to stay, even if the landowner agreed, unfortunately his way of life is in violation of local and state zoning and environmental regulations, and there is no access to a road. Unfortunately, while in jail, the cabin David had spent all those years in ended up burning down, with the fire being ruled accidental. After his release, supporters of David were able to find him temporary housing while he figures out what comes next for him. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Wild Man. This encounter story is a bit different than the others on this list today because of the time period it takes place in, and because we have actually no idea who this person living in the woods really was. Let's take it back to 1877. Gold miners are traveling through the Globe Valley in Caldwell County, North Carolina. As they traveled through, they encountered what they later described as a quote, wild man. The miners were shocked at what they were seeing because he appeared quite a bit taller than many people of the time, estimating this man to be about 6.5 feet. When the man caught a glimpse of the miners, it is said that he quickly turned around and proceeded into the woods. The miners, of course, went to track the man down. It was the 1800s after all, and it is said that they tracked him down to a cave. Here, they found his home, which included the bones of many animals scattered throughout, which showed them that he had clearly been here for a while. At the end of the day, no one is exactly sure who this man was, where he came from, or where he went, but it's clear that he was very comfortable living his life in the middle of the woods. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Derek L. Frierson. The information put out by authorities regarding this case states that the crime in question took place in 2015 on a night after the suspect had been drinking at a bar in the downtown Orlando area. After having a few too many, he apparently entered his vehicle to drive out of the downtown area. Already bad, for sure. The report continues on that he struck the rear of a vehicle which was stopped for a red light at the intersection of East Colonial Drive and North Mills Avenue. When he impacted, it is said that his car was traveling at 55 miles per hour, which is 88.5 kilometers per hour, and that it made no attempts to avoid the crash. This crash caused the death of one person in the vehicle that was sitting at the red light, along with another one of the passengers to become paralyzed from the waist down, while the other 3 in the vehicle all sustained other injuries as well. Derek was found to have had a blood alcohol level of 0.215 that night, which is over 2.5 times the legal limit to drive, and not only this, but he also is said to have had prior DUI convictions in Florida as well as Missouri. Unfortunately, authorities have reported that since this crash, Derek has left the Orlando area and is currently trying to evade these charges. There is an active warrant out for his arrest pertaining to multiple charges, all as a result of this accident. In our number 9 spot today, we have Harry Dana Braswell Jr. Okay, so for this one, we have to take it back in time a bit to Harry's initial arrest, which was on February 22nd, 1975. Harry was arrested for taking the life of John Robbins. Basically, a couple days before his arrest, on February 19th, Harry and 3 accomplices entered John's home, tied him to the bed, and took his life. Everyone involved in the crime was arrested at the same time as Harry, and subsequently, they were sentenced to life in prison. This obviously doesn't sound like someone who is on the loose, so what could have happened? Well, after serving 8 years of his sentence, Harry escaped. In 1983, at the Sumter Correctional Institute, Harry hid himself inside one of the cabinets that he and another inmate were loading onto a truck inside of the facility. Once the truck left the facility, he and the other inmate jumped off of the truck and voila, they had escaped. While the other inmate was later recaptured in Oregon, Harry was never able to be located and he remains at large. In our number 8 spot today, we have Joseph Obregon. Joseph has been wanted by the
the Tampa Police Department for the last year at least, but the crime at hand took place back on December 5th, 2017. Joseph was initially arrested after he caused a crash after allegedly racing his Dodge Ram pickup truck against another. This is of course already a crime, but things turned so much worse when, as he allegedly raced, he also crashed into an uninvolved Toyota RAV4 that was carrying 2 occupants. Because of the crash, one passenger, Bill Swartz, who is 78 years old, passed away at the scene. His wife Jane, who is 58 years old and was with him, ended up passing away at the hospital on January 20th, 2018. As a result of all of the charges brought against him, Joseph was set to appear in court on September 17th, 2021 after a plea deal was reached. Despite this seemingly initial early cooperation, Joseph failed to appear in court, after which a no bond warrant for his arrest was issued. In our number 7 spot today, we have Alfredo Acevedo. On June 9th, 2001, Alfredo was traveling southbound on State Road 93, which is on Interstate 75 in Charlotte County, and he was driving a 1984 white Chevrolet van. According to the statement the authorities put out, while traveling in this vehicle, Alfredo had a blood alcohol content that was almost twice the legal limit. This of course led to him losing control of the vehicle, which ended up overturned. At the time of this crash, Alfredo wasn't alone in the vehicle and instead had a few passengers with him. As a result of the crash, 2 passengers in the vehicle died and 2 others sustained incapacitating injuries. Despite the clear severity of the crash as well as the horrifying injuries sustained, Alfredo is still wanted by the Florida Highway Patrol to answer for his involvement in this crash. In our number 6 spot today, we have Gaspar de Gaspar. On February 3rd, 2015, Gaspar was traveling in a 1996 yellow Thomas passenger bus when he pulled into the Marathon gas station in Indiantown. This small community was shocked that day for what transpired next. As Gaspar was backing the bus into the parking lot, there were 2 men sitting on a bench in front of the station. For reasons that no one is exactly sure of yet, the bus didn't stop and instead ended up striking both men, leaving one pinned between the station and the bus. Unfortunately, this led to the man passing away at the scene. Gaspar is said to have exited the bus after this horrific moment, but instead of sticking around, he apparently fled the scene. Others have identified him as being from the town, but no one is entirely sure where he went. There is an active arrest warrant out for him for a hit and run. In our number 5 spot today, we have Uriel Aguilar. The incident involving this man is said to have taken place on June 26, 2008, when Uriel ran into another man named Pedro Trevino at the Prime supermarket in Mulberry, Florida. The men knew each other because they were co-workers, and there was a bit of a rocky history there because it is said that they had prior altercations with one another. Authorities reported that as Uriel and his brother were leaving the store, Pedro approached them and challenged Uriel to a fight. Uriel agreed to the fight, and when he went to meet Pedro in the parking lot for it, he also brought a weapon along with him. The two began fighting, and this is when Uriel used this weapon against Pedro, which ended up taking his life. After the fight, authorities claimed that Uriel fled the scene and was last seen in the area of Sparkman Road in Plant City before disappearing. Uriel still has an active warrant for this crime. In our number 4 spot today, we have Augustin Lara Nunez. Augustin is another one of those people who caused an accident and decided to flee the scene, fleeing the consequences of their own actions. On October 22nd, 2006, he was driving a 2006 silver Ford truck westbound on State Road 82. As he traveled, he encountered the scene of a prior crash that unfortunately involved a fatality. As a result of this previous crash and the investigation that needed to take place, there was a Lee County deputy who had positioned her marked patrol car facing south in the westbound lane with emergency lights activated, and a detour to avoid this accident had been set up. Like I mentioned, Augustin ended up allegedly coming across it, so it's clear that he wasn't paying attention or just flat out ignored the detour. This ended in the front of his vehicle striking the deputy's vehicle, which sadly ended in fatality for the officer. As a result of this crash, Augustin was charged with DUI involving death, and of course a felony arrest warrant was put out, but despite this, he has yet to be located and brought to justice. It is currently believed that he likely fled the country, but authorities are still on the lookout should he ever try and return to the United States. In our number 3 spot today, we have Jose Arturo Palomino. On February 28th, 2009, Jose was driving south of Sample Road in Pompano Beach on I-95 southbound in a 1996 silver Mitsubishi Eclipse. During this time driving, Jose ended up striking and killing a 23-year-old woman who was standing next to her vehicle on the shoulder of the roadway. This is of course tragic, and unfortunately accidents accidents do happen, but it's what happened next that turns this into an even bigger thing. Jose is said to have chosen to leave the scene of the crime. He fled the scene of the accident and later abandoned the car that he was in a field. Turns out that the car he was driving wasn't even his, as he took to calling the owner, explaining that it had been in an accident and that he was sorry for taking it without permission. Despite the time it's been, however, authorities have been unable to locate Jose in order to arrest him on the warrant of leaving the scene of a crash involving a death. Authorities believe it is highly possible that he has since left the country. In our number 2 spot today, we have Victor Hernandez. Victor has been on the run since 2018 as he is wanted for taking someone's life. On March 11th, 2018, it is said that Victor killed another man by the name of Luis L. Herrera Kindlin. This crime took place in Miami, and since the incident, Victor hasn't been found. In the poster about how Victor is wanted, authorities revealed that not only should he be treated as being armed and dangerous, but he also has one identifying feature about him, and that is the fact that he has a stoma in his throat. Right now, there is a reward for any tips that lead to his arrest. Right now, the Miami-Dade Florida Keys Crime Stoppers is offering a reward of up to $3,000, so if anyone has any information, they should definitely reach out to them to share, and all the tips will remain anonymous. In our number 1 spot today, we have Eric John Ritters. Eric is a wanted man and has been for quite a while now, since an incident that occurred on November 8th, 2002. Basically, that night Eric was traveling in a 1999 Oldsmobile northbound on Florida State Road 423, and he was going quite fast, definitely a lot faster than he should have been. As he sped, he allegedly lost control of the vehicle and ended up striking another car that was legally stopped. The front of Eric's car ended up hitting the driver's side door of the other vehicle, which caused significant damage, as well as very sadly led to fatal injuries for the driver, as well as the 2 other occupants of the vehicle that Eric hit. Eric was not only driving while intoxicated, but he was also going approximately 97 miles an hour at the time of the incident, despite it being a 45-mile-per-hour zone. I had to convert it to kilometers to get the full magnitude of the speed, so if you're like me, that's about 156 kilometers per hour in a 72 kilometer per hour zone. Despite these extensive injuries and the loss of life, Eric completely disappeared and still has 3 active warrants out for his arrest.
Starting us off at number 10, Jose Delgado. Starting us off strong, we're looking at an evil scientist. And I mean, what screams more possibility of a parallel universe than someone who's experimenting with technology ahead of their time? Jose Delgado graduated from the University of Madrid and later in 1946 went on to participate in a fellowship at Yale University. But Delgado was known for having an interest in a very peculiar line of research that left many of his peers uneasy: mind control. During his research, he was known to insert electrode implants into the brains of monkeys, and then using radio frequencies would force the primates to complete complicated movements. But that wasn't enough for the mad scientist. Next, he implanted electrodes into the brain of a bull before getting into a ring with him and making it charge at him, which he was able to successfully stop right before it hit him. From there, he began wiring up humans, but this time his device was not able to control them in the same way it had animals. This time the electrodes were only capable of inciting aggression, not pure mind control. But that wasn't gonna stop him. As he continued to aim for his mind control goals, he once famously said, quote, "We must electronically control the brain. Someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain." Now, was he stating a fact that he knew from another universe, or just a scientist gone mad? Let's hope it's the latter. Next up at number 9, Stubbins Firth. A famous physician, this guy may not have been the most evil on the list, but he might just be the most insane. Firth was a trainee doctor during the yellow fever epidemic in 1793 and had some rather interesting ideas about the disease. Now, yellow fever was one of the largest outbreaks in American history, killing roughly 10% of the population, so there was a lot of hands on deck at the time to try and get it under control. In 1801, Firth joined the University of Pennsylvania to begin researching the disease. as at the time no one knew what caused it or really how it transferred. Firth believed the disease was not contagious, and in an effort to prove his theory, he performed experiments on himself. Firth began bringing himself into direct contact with the infected bodily fluids, sometimes smearing vomit from infected patients into cuts on his arms, or even sometimes into his eyeballs. But he didn't stop there. He would smear his body with a myriad of other infected fluids from patients, and when he failed to contract the disease, he saw this as proof that yellow fever was not contagious. But later, when we understood the disease a little bit better, it was figured out that Firth was using samples from late-stage patients that were no longer contaminated with the virus. So he essentially did all that gross and insane stuff for nothing. Coming in at number 8, Robert G. Heath. Similarly to Jose Delgado, this evil scientist was also keen on diving into the world of mind manipulation, but not quite in the same way. Robert Heath was not as interested in domination of the brain so much as how to control the pleasure and pain receptors in the brain. While working at Tulane University, Heath discovered that by wiring up people's brains to electrodes, he was able to administer shocks that could either give them bursts of pleasure or pain depending on where he focused the shock. He went so far as inserting a narrow tube into the brain so that he could administer a chemical called acetylcholine, which resulted in virtual ecstasy and induced some rather pleasing events for those who received the shot. But on the flip, he could also cause complete and utter agony for the patients, making many wish that he would just kill them to end their suffering. Now, the reason that some think this guy could have maybe been from a parallel universe is because quite a few have since suspected Heath was involved with the CIA's illegal MK Ultra project and was researching mind control to help the government. And who better to help than someone from another dimension? Which, I mean, is it a conspiracy? Absolutely, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be possible. Coming in at number 7, Chris Watts. In 2018, Chris Watts came under a notorious spotlight for having convicted familicide, which is the killing of his entire family. Despite what seemed like a happy 6 years prior, one day Shannon, his wife, returned home from a business trip and everything was different. The couple got in a fight where Chris confessed he had a mistress and wanted to leave Shannon and get a divorce. Allegedly, Shannon threatened him, saying that if he did that, he would never see his family again. Chris then strangled his pregnant wife before loading her body along with the rest of their family into the car and driving it out into the woods to kill the last 2 members. Initially, Chris denied knowing the whereabouts of his wife, but just 2 days later confessed to the crimes. It came so out of left field that it almost seemed like a completely different person did the crimes. But no matter what you believe, at least the monster is behind bars for life. Coming in at number 6, Ilya Ivanov. Once again, another mad scientist on this list. Ilya Ivanov was a Soviet biologist who is famous for their studies on artificial insemination. But they also might be one of the most insane people I've ever read about. Now, to give you a bit of context, back in 1929, after years of campaigning, Ivanov was granted permission from the Bolshevik government to go ahead with his research. And what was that, you might be wondering? Well, Ivanov was trying to create a human-ape hybrid. Yes, you heard me right. Initially, it started out by the scientists grafting a human ovary into a chimp and then trying to fertilize the egg artificially, which is not great to begin with, but it got even crazier after that. Later that year, Ivanov traveled to Africa where he forcibly inseminated 3 chimps once again. When none of the animals fell pregnant, Ivanov decided to pivot into something even more drastic, impregnating a human woman with monkey sperm. Now, the wildest part of this is that he did manage to round up 5 volunteers for this experiment, but due to the political climate of the time, Ivanov was arrested and sent away to die, and the experiment was never finished. His research was so out of this world that it's hard not to wonder, was he maybe trying to recreate a species from an alternate universe that he was from? I guess we'll never know. Next up at number 5. Karl Klauberg. There were many evil scientists involved in World War II, and Karl Klauberg was among some of the most disgusting. Back in 1942, Klauberg approached Heinrich Himmler, who was a major figure in the German party at the time, and asked if he could receive a large number of women for research purposes. From there, his proposal was accepted, so off to the cruel camp he went. Once he was there, the so-called research began, and I mean truthfully, it was human torture under the guise of research. I'm sure you're wondering just what was Klauberg experimenting? Well, he wanted to figure out how to sterilize women in the most cost-efficient way, so he would inject formaldehyde directly into their stomachs without any painkillers. He experimented on thousands of prisoners, but only 700 survived, although all were left sterile. Another thing he would do was inseminate the surviving prisoners and then torment them by lying and saying he injected them with animal sperm to try and create a monster. Now, I don't know what it is about evil scientists and trying to make people birth non-human beings, but I can only assume that in some other version of reality, it has happened. Next up at number 4, Dr. Kurt Blohm. This man was also a member of the evil scientists during World War II, and just like the rest of them, performed indescribable acts on the prisoners. His main choice of torture was purposefully infecting the prisoners with cancer and typhus, but not because they were looking on how to cure it. No, they were literally looking on how to best cause it. The reason being that Blohm was in charge of all biological warfare in the SS, and so his experiments aimed to find the best way to use these diseases against their enemies, debilitating them. Once he even proposed dropping infected mosquitoes into targeted populations to try and infect them with malaria. But what is truly mind-blowing about the whole situation is that despite being arrested and put on the doctor's trial in 1947, and admitting to what he had done, the US intervened in his prosecution for wartime atrocities and got him off the hook. From there, the US Army Chemical Corps hired him to work on biological warfare projects in their country that remain classified to this day. And I mean, that's just a little bit too suspicious, don't you think? Coming in at number 3, Jack Parsons. Okay, so you may have noticed a running theme here. There's a lot of evil scientists on this list, and I am not stopping that trend just yet. Although for Jack Parsons, he started to get a little weird later in life. Once a well-respected scientist and graduate of the California Institute of Technology, in 1939, Parsons did a 180 and converted to Thelema, which is a sort of philosophy religion movement that was developed by the famous occultist Aleister Crowley. So after joining Thelema, Parsons became a different person, frequently spotted dancing nude around a fire as part of a pagan ritual, among other previously uncharacteristic habits. Later, Parsons made friends with the Scientology founder, and the pair would often attempt to raise the mother of the Antichrist and summon spirits. Their methods to make that happen? Well, apparently Parsons would, well, let's just say, enjoy himself while Hubbard took notes, or Parsons and his mistress would go to the bedroom while Hubbard recited scripture. Some think the swift change in Parsons' entire personality could have been some kind of alternate version of him from another reality coming into this dimension, but as he's no longer alive, I guess we will never know for sure. Coming in at number 2, Warren Jeffs. If you are a true crime documentary lover like me, then I am sure this is not the first time you've heard the name Warren Jeffs. Although now he's in prison serving a life sentence for his crimes, those that are still in the FLDS continue to consider Jeffs as the leader and prophet and believe he's been wrongly convicted. For those that haven't seen the doc, let me give you a little bit of context. The FLDS stands for Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's an extreme denomination denomination of the Mormon Church that relies heavily on polygamy. Their belief is that in order to get into the highest rank of heaven, you must have at least 3 wives. But realistically, the more you have, the better in their eyes. Now, there is a lot to unpack with this entire denomination. Honestly, I could probably write a whole video on it alone. But essentially, what you need to know is that under Warren Jeff's leadership, it came under fire as a hate group and a funnel for underage marriages. Prior to his arrest, it's believed Warren had 87 wives, many of which were not of legal age to marry, and he was not the only one in the FLDS to be in a similar situation. Using the excuse that God would come to him and tell him who was the next girl to be married off, he routinely placed very young girls with very old men and convinced his community that it was what God wanted. Warren Jeffs is truly a sick and evil man, and I am so glad they've got him locked up for life. And last up in our number 1 spot, Joseph Fritzl. Now, this might be one of the most heartbreaking cases I've ever read about. Born in 1935 in Austria, at 21, Joseph Fritzl married a girl named Rosemary, and the pair had 7 kids together. Now, he was a very man to everyone in his family, but especially Elizabeth. But the peak of his cruelty began when Elizabeth was 18. He lured her into the basement where he trapped her for the next 24 years of her life. In those 24 years, he assaulted her constantly, and during her imprisonment, she gave birth to 7 people. Of course, over the years, many were concerned about Elizabeth's disappearance, but Fritzl would lie and say that she'd ran off to join a cult and that he had no clue where she was. One day, after one of Elizabeth's offspring was ill, she managed to convince him to let them go to the hospital, and once they arrived, police were there on site to detain them. After making sure she would never be forced to see her father again, Elizabeth told authorities everything that her father ever did to her and her kin, and Fritzl was sentenced to life for his crimes. Some believe his acts were so cruel that he must have been from some parallel universe where Elizabeth wasn't his daughter, as it was so hard to believe that someone could do that to their own.
Starting off this countdown, we have Richard Pronek. Richard Pronek retired from the Navy and decided to become a naturalist. So he built his own cabin high in the Alaskan mountains, and he lived there alone off the land for nearly 30 years. He survived by hunting, fishing, and growing and gathering his own food. Only occasionally would he have some supplies flown into him. In fact, he even filmed what it was like living there, which was later re-edited and made into a documentary, Alone in the Wilderness. In 1999, at 83, he left his cabin and moved to California to live with his brother Jake. In 2003, he passed away from a stroke. In our 9th spot today, we have Christopher McCandless. Christopher McCandless was a 24-year-old American adventurer. In 1992, he set out for another wild adventure. Except this time, he decided to traverse the Alaskan wilderness and live off the land far from civilization. It was just him, his camera, and his journal, which he would use to document his journey. He was in the wild for 113 days before he sadly passed away. The way in which he died is still unknown, but it's mainly believed that he starved to death. Moving on to number 8, we have the Hobbit House Woman, aka Emma Orbach. Emma Orbach grew up in a castle, studied at and graduated from Oxford, and then went on to live off the grid by herself. She left her old life behind, even divorced her husband, and then went to live in the woodlands in Pembrokeshire. There she made her own Hobbit-style hut that she lives in. She grows her own food, even produces her own power. She said she needed to find peace in a society dominant of males, and living there has allowed her to do so. She even has her own farm animals that she cares for, including horses, goats, and chickens. She gets her water from a nearby stream and very rarely goes into town, but when she does, it's to get herself a little treat like chocolates. She said, and I quote, "This is how I want to live. This lifestyle makes me feel really happy and at peace, and this is my ideal home."
7. Phantom Stairs. So this story of stairs is from user Pope_Fenderson_2 on Reddit. 4 years ago, this person person left a story from an experience they had as a child. They were out with older relatives in bright daylight when they spotted stairs about 60 yards away and walked towards them until they were about 20 feet away. They said the stairs were made of wood, clean and polished with no dust and no leaves, kind of weird, and once they were that close, the light around them got dimmer and they looked back at their family. But their family looked much farther away than they actually were, and then a feeling of sheer terror hit them, so they just ran back. Once they got back to their family and told them what happened, they looked back, gestured, and the stairs were gone. When this poster's uncle heard the story, he became stern, saying, "There are things that appear different every time, these stairs or anything else, and these things lead to the spirit world, so avoid them." After this occurrence, the commenter lays down medicine and says a prayer of protection, then gets away whenever they see these stairs, and they recommend smudging yourself at the end of the day if you come across these things yourself. If you aren't worried or anything, at least, sage and smudging, it smells good, so it's never a bad idea. But on to number 6, waterproof stairs. From Melandon on Reddit, also 4 years ago, they went on a hike in the Cascades when he found 6 carpeted wood steps out in the woods and decided to investigate. It had begun to rain, but he wasn't fazed. And he kind of felt they were odd, but when he went up to them, the world kind of tilted slightly and sounded different. Like tinny different, and then as he went to step on the bottom step, he found himself not wanting to, and then sat down on the steps instead. Then he kicked off his boots and stepped on the carpet in his socks, which was oddly clean, but even more strange, it was dry. It had been raining for a while at this point, so that was kind of odd. And then he walked to the top of the stairs in his socks, and he described it as if the sound shifted even more, as if the sound was forming to a point, and then he stood there, was like, and went back down and left. So nothing bad happened, but it was a strange experience because it wasn't raining on the stairs and the sound was weird. But on to number 5, protected stairs. Now this was posted by Von Meowstein about 3 years ago, and they loved wandering in the woods either alone or with friends, and they'd come across stairs every often, not really thinking much of it. Then one time they were out looking with friends and came upon a dog that looked kind of like a wolf, aka a husky, and it was sitting by a set of stairs. And so the writer of this story approaches the dog that turns out to be friendly, but then wants to check out the stairs to see if there's any puppies, like I'd do that. But the thing is, when they do this, the husky tries to nudge them back to their group. And at the time, they thought this was the possibility of the dog trying to get some food from them, but on second thought, maybe it was a warning away from the stairs. They kind of left kind of confused, but if anything, the dog was protecting them. But on to number 4, survival stairs. Redditor Nizagard posted their own story about when they were on an island southeast of Alaska on an army survival test. Having few supplies, living in a dense forest and living off nature, he came across a random staircase in the middle of this dense forest. His army buddies write off this account of this experience because he was out alone in the wood for 3 days, but he swears he saw this. A staircase that was perfectly clean, just stark in the middle of the forest, no fallen leaves on it or anything. Then there was a strange feeling telling him not to investigate it when he puts his feet up on the staircase. Then he feels nauseous as the sounds around him fade away, something we've heard before, and then he snaps out of it, running far away without looking back. He says it freaks him out to this day, and it was an experience that came out of nowhere, and then now still, no one believes him. I feel like a lot of people are getting the nauseous in the sounds. But let's see where it leads with number 3, stairs lead to fall. Now this is from a deleted account, but a pair of people found remnants of an old house that must have been around from the 50s or the 60s, and the house was gone, but some furniture remained, plus an eerie metal staircase. So this guy that found it, plus his friend Matt, found it weird too, because there was moss winding around it and some green mold, but Matt decided to check it out. This story goes downhill from here. Matt made it to the top, but when he got there, he became so nauseous that he threw up and fell from the top of the stairs. Although it was about an 8-foot drop, Matt let out a scream because it turns out he had gruesomely broken his leg. After some quick first aid, the two noticed the woods became silent, except for a scream similar to the one Matt let out when he fell, heard further away. Then it was closer, and it had a lower tone and a kind of sound like it was wheezing. So they got up to start to leave, and there it was again, the wheezing scream, maybe 30 feet away, and then they tried to move as fast as they could. The screams from then on became more distant until they were finally out of the woods and able to get Matt some needed medical attention. But the person who wrote this said they moved away since then and warned people to stay away from things that make them feel off. So that's not an experience you want to have, really. On to number 2, stairs all the way down. Now, Redditor Neb r_stairs from 4 years ago made their account just to talk about their stairs they found southeast in Nebraska. They were with some friends investigating the ruins of an abandoned farm, and they discovered a staircase going down. A lot of them we see are going up, and they say it was separate from the house ruins there, made out of brick, well engineered, and the group walked down for at least 3 flights of stairs with this horrible sense of dread. They described it as time slipping, sounds going away, and their flashlights going in and out. And they said that the stairs continued further down the 3 flights, but water limited the rest of their descent down, so who knows how far down they could go. But on to number 1, Amazon stairs. And this was from V838 on Reddit. So this is a story from a commenter's grandma that lived in an indigenous community in the Amazon long ago. Now, people tended to get lost around the area, including this story that her grandma told about an old man. He left to go check on the fishing nets in the river but was lost for 2 weeks, only found after women doing their laundry in the river found him trying to empty water out of a canoe with a bowl while it was raining. Now, the older man said that when he was out he saw a set of stairs in the forest and climbed them. Then he only remembers being in that canoe out in the water for 2 hours, but he was missing for 2 weeks. People had been looking for him and had been to that area. And then another thing, he said he was taking out water from the canoe because there was a hole in it, but that's not the case. There were no holes apparently, and yes there was water, but that's because it was raining. And he had begun to damage the wood in the canoe from dragging the bowl he was using across the same area, so how long was he really out there? What happened with the staircase? I want to know. It's just weird, man, you know? It's kind of weird. Starting at number 10, Army Base Stairs. From Reddit user IronBoy21, 3 months ago, they shared their own story. This one is not in the woods, but I say it's a chilling story about stairs nonetheless. This user was on a North American Treaty Organization deployment, or NATO deployment, with the army, and they were the person that sticks their head out of the hatch to look around while someone else is driving a tank. Now, while driving through a huge open field, they spot a staircase and decide to stop because it looks like it'll lead to a crawl space and it seems cool enough to check out basically. They stop and approach it and find some strange markings on the staircase. And then at this point, we know I'd be running, like turning around and running for it, but this group decides now we're gonna go check it out. And well, they get inside this strange little space that's big enough for maybe 3 people and find more strange markings, and they find human bones. The person who wrote this thinks a family hiding from war might have hidden in the cellar, but they still think it's odd since it's the only house for at least 100 miles around, since it's in an army training area. And then they end the passage with 3 little words. So, I don't know. They just don't know what happened. But from that mystery, let's move on to number 9. Island Forest Stairs. This is from Coated Lemons on Reddit about 3 months ago as well. They were on an Ohio camping trip up to Lake Erie on a small unknown island a friend told them about. So he sets up camp to eat and like hang out and then decides I'm gonna explore the island a bit before it gets dark. 10 minutes in, he finds a structure that he investigates to find it's a stone staircase, but there's no indication that the stairs are remains from a house. There's no rotting wooden structures, no bricks, nothing of the sort. So at that point he felt nothing odd and he was like, and I quote, "Hell yeah, gonna go back to the tent, read a book." But that's when his mood shifted. He got a horrible wave of anxiety and that he should run back to safety. But then again, he thought about the stairs. Then he felt compelled to go to them with his mind in a fog. He said, "It was like a wave of indifference and curiosity washed over me and I had this compulsion to go to them. I drifted over to the bottom, staring at the top. I was staring like a zombie, slowly walking up 2 steps at a time. I felt catatonic. I felt so out of it, so mentally blank, like something in me completely took over and I just acted out of primal steps. I was 3/4 of the way up when I snapped out of it and I ran. I ran as fast as I could. I felt so scared, like in my chest I was tearing up. I was running for my goddamn life." And so after that scary incident I just recounted, he got so mixed up with directions he ended up back at the stairs, freaked out again, and then ran again and somehow made it back to his tent. Then even more weird stuff happened that night, but to keep us on track with stairs, I'll just let you know that once he left, he came back again to the same island with a friend and they searched the entire island but could never find those stairs again. So the mysterious stairs that gave that crazy feeling, who knows where they went. At number 8, Staircase Creek.
This next story is from Redditor Siavri from a while back, and when she was younger she would go hiking in the woods in California, and one time she had a really trippy experience. She was a little lost admittedly and found a creek so that she could follow it downstream, because it's recommended that if you're lost, follow the path of water downstream if you're lost. And at some point she had to step into the water to like follow the creek because the sides of the creek were too high, and one of those times she found herself walking down moss-covered stairs. She couldn't really see the bottom of where they went and was nearly slipping due to the water running over the mossy steps. But then, even though it was around noon, the sky turned dark and everything went quiet. This is when she truly tripped and fell, and she says she fell into the dark. She woke up alone in a meadow with marks on her arms with no trace of the staircase or the stream. So the staircase and her just kind of got mixed up. I don't know.
But on to number. In our 7th spot, we have Timothy Treadwell. Timothy Treadwell was an American environmentalist and documentary filmmaker. He lived among the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska for 13 summers. He was actually a bear enthusiast and was the founder of the bear protection organization Grizzly People. Little did he know that this would lead to his downfall. In October of 2003, Timothy and his girlfriend were out living in the woods when they were attacked, killed, and eaten by a bear. They had lived among them for 13 summers with no scary run-ins until the end of the last summer. In our 6th spot today, we have Noah John Rondeau. In 1916, a man named Noah John decided to live in the woods on a bluff above Cold River in upstate New York County by himself. He managed to live there for 30 years. There he built 2 cabins, one to cook and sleep in, the other to house his supplies. Now, he lived there alone, but he did say that visitors were welcome. He deemed himself mayor of Cold River City, population 1. He then lived off the land by hunting and trapping animals. But sadly, in 1950, he was forced out of his home due to a hurricane. The hurricane destroyed parts of his home and the area was closed. So he then went to live around Lake Placid, Saranac Lake, and Wilmington. Eventually, he went on to rejoin society before dying in 1967 at the age of 73. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Everett Roos. Everett Roos was an American artist, writer, and poet who liked to spend most of his time exploring the High Sierra, the California coast, and the deserts of the American Southwest alone. In fact, he was one of the first Americans to reach out to indigenous individuals and live among them. But he never spent more than a day or two with other humans. He preferred to live alone, so he was constantly on the move. While traveling, he found success in trading his artwork for food or other necessities that he needed. However, in 1934, at only 20 years old, Everett disappeared without a trace. He disappeared while traveling through a remote area of Utah. To this day, no one knows what happened to him, but some say he accidentally died after falling from a cliff. In our 4th spot today, we have the Maine Hermit. For nearly 30 years, stories were being told in North Pond, Maine of a hermit living in the woods. This hermit would apparently creep into homes and steal food, clothing, tools, and other supplies. Again, many people thought that this was just a legend, like if something went missing, they're like, oh, I bet it was the hermit that took it. That was until 2013 when they realized that this story was real, and there actually was a hermit living in the woods. His name was Christopher Knight, and he had been living in the woods since around 1986. It's said that he would commit more than 38 robberies per year so that he could get the necessities to survive. But he also liked to steal books to help him pass time. In the end, he was arrested and charged for robbery. Moving on, number 3, we have Henry David Thoreau, aka Ellen DeGeneres' long-lost twin. For some reason, people believe that Henry and Ellen look alike. I mean, I kinda see it. It's mainly in the eyes, you know? But I remember there was an image of a side-by-side comparison of the two of them, and it went viral, and people were like, oh my god, Ellen's a time traveler. Anyways, that's not the point. Well, Henry was an American author, naturalist, and philosopher. He's probably best known for his book titled Walden, which is about the time he spent living alone in a cabin in Massachusetts. Basically, his goal was to isolate himself from society so that he could gain a more objective view of it. He lived in a cabin for about 2 years before re-entering society, and after doing so he became more independent and apparently went through a voyage of spiritual discovery. Coming in at number 2, we have Father Maxime. The Katashki Pillar is a massive 40 meter or 130 foot pillar composed of limestone rock. On top of the pillar is one of the most sacred as well as isolated places on Earth. earth. In 1993, a monk named Father Maxime decided that he was going to live on top of there, and he has done that for over 20 years now. However, he does leave the pillar, but only twice a week. When he does want to leave, he has to scale a 131-foot ladder, and it takes him 20 minutes to climb up and down it. What's crazy is that when he first moved to the top of the pillar, he lived in a fridge. He did this for 2 years in order to protect himself from the elements. That was before a cabin was built there for him. But for those 2 years, he literally had nothing up there, and it was just him and a fridge. Isn't that insane? He says that he plans to stay there until the day that he dies. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Masafumi Nagasaki, aka the Naked Hermit. And he was given this name because he lives on a secluded, uninhabited island, naked and alone. Now, he was a photographer, but when he retired, he decided to move to this remote island and live there. When there, he decided that clothes just weren't for him. He said it felt right to be naked. But he will get dressed for when he needs to go make a trip to get food and water. He makes a trip to get supplies weekly, but the trip is actually an hour away by boat. He mainly lives on boiled rice cakes, which he eats 4 or 5 times a day. He lived on this island for 3 decades before he was forced back into civilization. And that's because he was found deeply sick on the island, so the Japanese authorities forced him to go to a hospital with no hope of returning to this island.